Good afternoon, everybody. I see the court reporter's vast virtual office on my screen, which makes me think that maybe we're back on the record.
We're on the record.
Okay, great. Mr. Rankin, I think you said before we broke that you might have maybe an hour more or so. So you're it. Dr. Buckwalter, I probably don't need to remind you, you're still under oath.
I'll tell the truth.
You don't need to do it again.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. I'm just getting myself back connected to the Wi-Fi. Good afternoon, Dr. Buckwalter. Sorry for the pause.
No problem whatsoever.
Is the model, the base map, the E1 map, it's the same between, I guess it should be a little different. The rebuttal map should have the extra 2 wells and extra 2 SWDs in it, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I'll use that one. This is your exhibit M1 from your rebuttal, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that I'm showing on the screen.
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to point out a well here that's, and just confirm that it's included in your model. This well up here, I can't quite tell what section it's in, but it's the one I'm highlighting. Do you see this well in green?
Yes.
And that is a Rice SWD well, correct? Based on your map?
I would have to check my model to confirm it's on the map, but I believe all those wells are, I think all the wells on the map are included in my model, yes.
Okay. And this model, this assuming that it is, based on the fact that it's on your map.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. This well would be connected to every other cell in your model, right?
Yes, it would.
And if we had reservoir pressures for this well at this location prior to initiation of the water flood in the San Andreas, would that data be relevant to your analysis of the model?
It probably would be, yes.
Yeah. Is there a reason why sitting here today, it wouldn't be relevant if it were in the San
I
Andreas?
see no reason why it would not be.
Okay. That well would appear to be this well in yellow up here, just to the north of the EMSU. I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see the colors.
Yeah,
and
can
the
I
label.
expand on what I just said a little bit? It's not relevant unless it's got enough production, enough history to where it would impact the total WCD rate of all these wells appreciably.
So my question to you was, if we had reservoir pressures from that well prior to injection in the well at that location in the San Andres, would it be relevant to your analysis of the model?
Yeah, it could be. I don't know how different it would be.
I guess my question is though, you only had one pressure data point prior to as a initiation pressure for the San Andres, right?
That is correct.
And then you
I
had
only
one
point.
one pressure point for at the end of primary production in the Grayburg and San Andres, correct?
That is correct.
So this would be a pressure point that was in between the field discovery and end of primary production. If it were, somewhere in between there, it would be relevant to your model, right?
It could be. I mean, when was the pressure taken? It depends when the pressure was taken too.
Say it was taken in 1959.
Well, I mean, the one pressure point I have is in 1980, I think, is it 1986? Is that what I believe, or 87? The one point I have. So if you take a point earlier than that, I'd have to look at the model.
But I guess my point is it would help. I mean, it was another data point to tie your model to.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it could.
It would be helpful. I mean, if you had that data point, you would use it, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would.
Yeah. Now, looking at this map, which shows this is a exhibit from Goodnight Midstream. It's exhibit number B47. It's from Mr. McGuire's rebuttal testimony. And I'll just flip back so it's fresh at the top of mind to your exhibit M. I'm sorry. I think it's M1. I should have had that in my mind. M1. Okay. Flipping back to M1 so we can see this map. There's a well that's approximately 1.5 sections north. I can't read the section numbers, but it's just to the north of the EMSU, right up here on the corner. Do you agree that that appears to be the same well?
I believe it. I think so.
Yeah.
From what I'm seeing, it's outside our unit, right? Yeah.
Just a section and a half to the north. Oh man.
We just lost our monitor, so please hold on.
Yeah.
Sheila back there. Oh, okay, there you are. Madam Court Reporter, just to make sure that you are we're
Yes,
on the
I'm
record.
still here.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Sorry, Mr. Rankin.
It's okay.
Go ahead.
No problem. I thought it was me. Okay, so back to where we were. So just about a section and a half north of the EMSU, there's a well here. It's got a yellow triangle on the legend to the right. The yellow triangles reflect that it's a Rice operating well and it's active. Do you see that?
Okay.
Do you have any reason to dispute or not disagree that that well is the same well we were just looking at on your exhibit M1?
No.
Okay. Going back to your direct testimony, looking at paragraph 2 on this page of your exhibit E, I believe it's the bottom of page or the middle of page 3. In paragraph 2, you state a key element of the study was including 435 million barrels of water produced from the San Andres by the water supply wells, primarily during the 1986 to 2005 period to inject into the Grayburg. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
I'll just go back to your rebuttal slide, your M1, and just so I'm aware, I'm not sure they're shown here, but my understanding is that you included the 6 known water supply wells in the EMSU unit and then 2 water supply wells in the AGU. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And based on the data that you were given by Empire, the total volumes produced by those 8 wells from the San Andres is about 435 million barrels.
Correct.
Okay. But your model, so those are the only water supply wells that your model includes, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't include the volumes of water supply wells outside of that, those 8 wells, correct?
No, if I included other wells, it would depend how far away they are and how much they injected. But in order to get a match on the model, no.
So I'm showing here what is Goodnight's Exhibit B19 from Mr. Preston McGuire. And this map, I believe I showed you during the deposition that we had with you. And it shows all the wells that Goodnight has identified in the area as water supply wells. And I believe, just to confirm with you, that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the EMSU that you included in your model, and then the 2 in the Arrowhead Grayburg unit that you include in your model.
Correct.
But all the other dots here that are indicated as water supply wells, you did not include in your model, correct?
But aren't some of those inactive or?
Some of them,
Before-
let me just
I
find.
think the colors.
Yeah, so
They're
some of them
all
are,
different. Some are PNA'd and.
yeah, so at different times, some of them are active. This indicates the current status of the wells. So some of them are currently still active, some of them are inactive, some of them have PNA'd, and some of them are TNA'd.
Right.
Okay, but the only wells you include in your model are the 6 in the EMSU and the 2 in the AGU, correct?
Correct.
Okay. This next exhibit I'm showing is Goodnight Exhibit B46, and this is in Mr. McGuire's rebuttal testimony. This is Mr. McGuire's tabulation of the volumes calculated and estimated from those water supply wells. Have you had a chance to review Mr. McGuire's rebuttal testimony, Dr. Buckwalter?
I've reviewed this figure, I believe.
Okay. Now, this is just a summation of volumes of water produced from those wells based on calculation of OCD records and estimates from well tests. And he summed it up to be over 850 million barrels of water produced from those wells. But that volume was not included in your or any volumes from those wells were not included in your model, correct?
That is correct, because if those wells were communicating with the Grayburg, then we would never have a history match. So they're must be communicating with some other part of the San Andreas. Unless those wells are really far away, then that may not matter. But wells in this near vicinity, apparently the San Andreas geology is complex, and the 6 wells I've got are a good fit.
They're a good fit because the volumes you used fit your model. But if you had included these volumes, would your model still work?
No, it would never work. Not even close.
Yeah.
I mean, the original model, I was only maybe a couple 100 million barrels shy, or maybe less than that, on the water supply wells, and that was left out of my model, and I just could not fit the model. So, apparently these other wells, I mean, if they were in the San Andreas, they're not draining the same compartment as the area under the Grayburg.
And that's your conclusion based on your assumed size of the San Andreas and the volumes in the San Andreas?
No, it's just based on material balance. We have the pressures, the pressure in the San Andreas in 1986. If we add all this water in, you're never going to get that pressure.
Okay. Going back to your direct testimony, I'm going to look at same paragraph here, another section that I've highlighted. You address the volumes of water disposed by Goodnight and Rice in the San Andreas Reservoir. You say that the pressure is now increased above the original reservoir pressure in some areas. And you go on to state that your model predicts that the rate of water influx into the Grayburg will increase from 24,000 barrels of water per day to 46,000 barrels of water per day by January 2028, and then 52,000 barrels of water per day by January 2033. assuming that the 7 application SWD wells are not drilled. So that doesn't include the 5 additional wells in the unit that are being proposed and the 2 outside the unit, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So just looking at these 2 sentences, this conclusion is based on the original reservoir pressure information that you received from Mr. William West, right?
The 570 million barrels.
Well, the conclusion that you've drawn from those 2 sentences about the volumes of water that must be reaching the Grayburg, and I mean the whole conclusion about these 2
Correct.
sentences, it's largely it's the root assumption is based on the original reservoir pressures, correct?
You mean at time 1938?
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole model has to tie into 1938 or it wouldn't work. I mean, you know, as I said, with the injection volumes I was given and the water supply volumes I was given, everything fit.
Okay. Okay, so then going back to your model, we had these, I believe this now has 25 SWDs in it, right? The 23 that you originally included, and then the 2 additional ones that you added afterwards, which are the MSU SWD number 1, and then the Parker well, which is just outside the unit, just on the edge of your model boundary, right?
Correct.
And based on your conclusions in your testimony, I understand that your conclusions are that the model results should be sufficient to establish that all the wells within 5 miles of these units should be shut in. Is that your conclusion?
That's a rule of thumb. I mean, as you can see, even if there's additional saltwater disposal wells around here that have produced more than those numbers you just cited, in my mind, they're not part of this problem, really.
So let's go back to that map. Okay, so you talked about 5 miles. All SWDs within 5 miles should be excluded, but you've only included the 25 wells and the volumes for those 25 wells in your model, right?
Correct. I mean, that's just a rule of thumb. I mean, it could be much closer. I just don't know how the San Andreas geology and how this reservoir is broken up, but apparently it's very complex.
Yeah. So in this map, which is B47, I was showing previously, this is Mr. McGuire's rebuttal testimony, exhibit B46. I've identified and highlighted on his exhibit all the wells that let me rephrase this. Basically, I guess my question is, but in your model, you did not include all the SWDs within 5 miles of the unit, right?
No, I did not.
Okay. And looking at this map that shows all the SWDs based on the OCD's division records, it shows both historical, inactive and shut-in wells, as well as active injectors. I'm not going to sit here and count them with you, but there are more than 60 SWDs within that 5 mile radius. So your opinion is, as a rule of thumb, that these wells within 5 miles should be shut in?
Well, what I would say is if these wells had significant water volumes injected, then we haven't seen that influence in the model.
If you did include all these volumes in your model within 5 miles, what would it do to your model?
And I would have to add up the volumes and see what it comes. Well, you told me what comes to 800 something, right? We wouldn't have a match.
Well, no, this is the injected volume. So before I was talking about the water withdrawal volumes.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, everything's got to fit. So if there's other saltwater disposal wells with significant injection volumes, then it would be a different model. But here's the thing. It's not just injection volumes that you need to worry about. It's water supply volumes. So you need to put the whole picture together. And you just can't look at one side of the coin and see what the other side looks like here. So I know I have a good match And if you integrate these other saltwater disposal wells, then you probably also have water supply wells, I would imagine, as well. Or you may, I don't know. I just know what I was given and it fits.
So I'm just laying out so people are tracking. Okay, so going to your direct testimony, I think it's E5. This is your direct testimony exhibit E5, and it shows your cumulative saltwater disposal volumes that you included in your model, correct?
Correct.
And it goes back to 1994, correct?
Correct.
And is it your understanding that it goes back to 1994 because that's the first year that the reported water disposal volumes are available on the division's records?
I didn't know that. I was just given the data.
Okay.
So I just added it.
So going back to this map, I've got up exhibit B47, which is the 5 mile area map. You see that I've highlighted on this map each of the wells that has a first injection date prior to 1994 based on the OCD records. So all of these wells and their volumes wouldn't have been included in your model because they had injection prior to 1994, correct?
I mean, I can't confirm that. I don't have that information.
Okay. And because you didn't include volumes prior to 1994, and you didn't include all the SWDs within this area, if we were to include all the volumes prior to 1994 for the wells you did include, and all the wells and the volumes that you didn't include, what would that do to your pressure match throughout the term of your model?
Well, I can't answer that because there may be other things going on. For example, there may be water supply wells in here as well.
There definitely are, right? And we talked about that.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. So you'd want to be able to include all that to understand what the effect is at the end, right?
I can include all that, but ultimately some of these wells may be producing another part of San Andreas for whatever reason. So,
Okay.
you know, I'd put in all the data and see if it could fit. Originally, when I built my model, I could not get it to fit because I was missing some of the water supply well volumes. So, I mean, it's all going to have to fit one way or another. And, you know, just ask me if I put all this stuff in, I can't give you an answer because I'd have to put in also the water supply wells. So,
Got it. One of Empire's claims is that as Goodnight injects water into the San Andreas, it's going to overpressure the San Andreas and cause them to have to spend more money when they want to do their CO2 flood because the volumes of CO2 that they're going to want to inject are going to have to increase based on the increased pressure in the formation. Do you understand that?
yes, I mean, let me go back to what we just talked about. At the end of the day, you're not going to come up with the pressure in the San Andreas in 1986 and currently if you put in all these wells. So, you know, that's real data that needs to be matched. And if you cannot match that data, then some of those wells have to be in another compartment. It's that simple.
So let me, I mean, this is.
I mean, that's hard data. You're showing, you know, you're showing hard data too.
Yeah.
But it's all going to have to fit one way or another, or we don't have a matched model.
So
That's simple.
Yeah. So, but I guess my question to you though is that I'm giving you data for wells in the San Andreas, and you're telling me it's not going to fit in your model, and I'm saying I guess I understand that because there's something inherently wrong with your model. Maybe the volume of the San Andreas is not big enough, or there may be some other issues. But I guess my point is simply if you were to include all those volumes, you're telling me it wouldn't work, right? The way it's constructed.
To the question and Mr. Rankin testifying.
Can you rephrase?
Yeah. Dr. Buckwalter.
Well, go
Doc-
ahead. Go ahead. You can.
Dr. Buckwalter, my point here, I guess I'm hearing you tell me that based on these additional volumes, you're telling me that it won't fit in your model, right?
Here's what I'm saying is I have production, injection for San Andreas. I've got an initial pressure. I've got a pressure in 1986. And if that is real data. And if I put in a bunch of additional water injectors, I will never be able to get that pressure to match. Because if you think about it, right in this small area in the aquifer, water's incompressible. The pressure doesn't vary a lot over this area in the San Andreas, in this limited aquifer we have under the Grayburg. So you put all that production as, it's still not that far away. It's not 33 miles, correct? Like how far away are those wells? Adam, if I can ask you a question. They're not that far.
They're not that far. My question then is, you're telling me that you wouldn't be able to get it to match, and my reframe question back to you is, you wouldn't be able to get it matched based on the assumptions that you've incorporated in your model, correct?
No, I wouldn't be able to get to match based on the data I need to fit in the model, which is hard data, production and pressures. It's that simple.
Okay. Moving on to this next question here. I think we already addressed this. So I'll move on to the next one. Oh, actually, I didn't. I was in the middle of asking this question. Okay, about the CO2 issue in the San Andreas. Your understanding is that Empire is making a claim that as Goodnight injects disposal water into the San Andreas, it's pressuring up the San Andreas, and that's going to cause them to spend more money when they intend to purchase CO2 for their proposed CO2 flood. That's your understanding, right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. But this passage here that I'm highlighted here on the bottom of page 4 that addresses that issue, that's a passage that Empire inserted into your testimony, correct?
Yes, I did, but I read it and it seemed reasonable.
Okay, so they inserted it, but you evaluated it and it seemed reasonable, so you kept it in.
Right. If you increase the pressure, then you have to inject more CO2 for the same volume.
But you weren't asked to do an independent assessment evaluation on what the impact would be on CO2 purchases or volumes in this case, were you?
Object to the question. I think it misstates his testimony.
I can answer that. It just wasn't part of my study.
Okay, I just wanted to know if it was part of your scope of work.
No, it was not.
Okay.
I would have overruled the objection for the record if I'd had a chance.
Good. I'm glad I answered it then. Keep things moving.
All right.
'Cause I got a plane to catch.
Yeah. So this next page, paragraph 4, you're going to say that the model indicates that we're currently producing roughly 23,000 barrels of water per day more than if no water disposal had occurred in the past. Did I read that correctly?
That is correct.
So your model's showing that there's currently about 23,000 barrels per day being produced as a result in the Grayburg as a result of the injection that's occurring in the San Andreas, correct?
Yes. Would you like me to explain how I come up with this number?
No, because I think I don't want to. I want to get to my questions.
Okay.
But I don't mean to cut you off. But
No, that's fine.
I just want to. Because I have other questions I want to get through, and you do
Okay.
have a plane to catch. Now the model. So got the basis here. Your model predicts that currently, as we sit here today, about 23,000 barrels of water is coming up into the Grayburg as a result of the injection that's occurring in the San Andreas, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, if that's the case, right, and that's what your model is showing, how would you confirm that with engineering field data?
That's what I was going to tell you before. Here's what you do. You take the match model and you run it, okay? And then you take that same match model and I turn off all the saltwater disposal wells from time 0 and you run it again and see what happens.
I guess my question, though, was not what the model is going to show. I'm asking about with engineering field data. How would you go out to the field and evaluate whether or not currently 23,000 barrels of water more are being produced in the Grayburg than would otherwise be the case.
That would be really hard because you got water coming from different sources. You actually need to build a model to be able to figure this out.
Wouldn't you just look, couldn't you look at production profiles?
Well, right now you've got water injectors, you've got producers, and
Couldn't you look for changes in oil production over time from before and after, or during the time of injection of these disposal wells? I mean, isn't there something we could do in the field?
well, yeah, ultimately, and it's kind of what you could do. You can look at essentially if you take the model from time zero and you shut it off and you history match the model, and you history match the oil, the gas, and then the water that's produced historically without the San Andreas communication, you just run it to currently, you can see that there's a deficit in the water that's produced. In other words, we're producing less water. There's less water between what we can produce out of the Grayburg by itself and with the saltwater disposal. It ends up with a deficit essentially. And that you could do it that way too, but
Dr. Buckwalter, I know you're a reservoir simulator and a modeler, but I guess you've given us an output here from your model. And I'm asking you, because the commission's sitting here and they're trying to figure out what's actually happening. What can we do to go out and evaluate to confirm whether or not that's actually the case in the field? And I'm saying, would it be
Okay.
possible to see it in, wouldn't you see that volume on a daily basis in production profiles?
I think it's be hard. You want to know how you really could do it? Just shut everything in the Grayburg and wait 6 months and see what the pressure is. If it doesn't change, then we have no communication with the San Andreas. Otherwise it's just really hard. You got a lot of moving parts, water's moving here, water's moving there, it's taking, high perm channels here and there. It's just a very complex reservoir. So, I mean, the way it's kind of like what you do often, if you want to figure out what the reservoir pressure is, you shut it in.
Okay.
That's what you could do operationally. I don't think that would be feasible though.
So you're telling me that you don't think, based on these volumes, you might see anything in the field production profiles?
So you just, I don't know, I'd have to try it and see.
Well, let me just put this into context. I mean, we talked about it earlier. Goodnight, I told you, based on the average injection rates over the life of their injection, that Goodnight's injecting on average about 14,000 barrels of water per day in each of its wells. So 24,000 barrels is another 120, 30%. I mean, that's a significant jump over even one of the, it's like having another well and a half of Goodnight's disposal wells just dumping right into the middle of the Grayburg. You're telling me that the field-wide, even offsetting well profile production profiles wouldn't show that?
I object to the question. I think it's misleading with respect to Goodnight's injection rates. I also think it's compound, it's argumentative. I think it's got many problems.
Adam, I'll
Well,
give you a simple solution
okay.
to the problem.
Doctor, you have to wait.
Wait for
Oh, I'm
the,
sorry.
wait for a ruling, please.
The objection has to be ruled upon.
Oh, sorry.
It's a long and complicated question, but it's a complicated, and the whole thing is complicated. Doctor, if you disagree with any of the assumptions built into
Well-
the question, I think you can correct them. So
Yeah, let me, I
hold
think
on.
about
I'll
I-
overrule the objection. Go.
Okay, here's what you could do. Just watch the shut-in pressures in the San Andreas. They're going to build up in the next few years. That's the easiest way to do it.
To your knowledge, have you yourself asked to confirm or sought to confirm your model outputs against engineering field data?
Well, I put in all the production and pressures, so that's what it's literally I think all the production for a number of years is monthly that's put in for both production injections. So yes, I mean, everything you see here is the field data I was given, and I match against that.
Okay. This next exhibit I'm going to put up has not been introduced. It's a new exhibit. I've taken Mr. Buckwalter's model on the left. It's an Empire Exhibit E2, and I've taken Dr. Lindsay's a part of his exhibit Empire B5, and I just put them together on one page. And I would move the admission of this Goodnight Cross Exhibit number 5.
Any objection from Empire?
Well, I object to the extent that Mr. Rankin apparently intends to question Dr. Buckwalter about one of Dr. Lindsay's exhibits. And he's here as a reservoir modeler, and this is a geology exhibit from Dr. Lindsay.
Well, we'll have to see what the questions are, I think. Are there any objections from OCD?
No, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice,
No objections from Rice.
Pilot?
No objections from Pilot.
And my understanding is Empire E2 and Empire B5 are already individually admitted.
They are. These are portions of those exhibits, not the full exhibits, just so I could fit it on a page.
Ms. Hardy, your objections noted, but overruled. They'll, I don't know what you're going to call this exhibit, but it's admitted.
It'll be Goodnight Cross Exhibit number 5. Dr. Buckwalter, you were present for Dr. Lindsay's testimony this week, correct?
Correct.
And you told me today that the two most important inputs for your model were the starting reservoir pressure and the geology, correct?
Correct.
This exhibit shows your geologic model on the left, or part of it, at least the layers. In your opinion, does it accurately reflect the geologic and stratigraphic complexity that Dr. Lindsay discussed with the 88 stratigraphic cycles within the Grayberg?
What my model reflects is the average porosity and permeability. That's a composite of what you're seeing on the right.
Okay. So I'm going to pull up another new exhibit. This is, I can find it here real quick. This is, this will be Goodnight Cross Exhibit number 6. And Dr. Buckwalter, this is what we pulled this from your model. On the left is the porosity, on the right is the permeability for what we understand are the inputs for porosity for each of those layers we just were looking at, and the permeability for each of those layers. Does that look correct to you?
Yeah, it looks about correct.
Okay. Now, it shows that your vertical perm here, which is on the right-hand side of the table on the right, that's titled permeability, and it's the vertical perm is the KZ, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So as to each of those model layers, you've assigned a vertical permeability of generally 1 between each of the zones, except for the bottom of the Penrose, correct?
Correct.
And then you've assigned a variable permeability for the San Andreas, which I believe is layer 8, right?
I believe so.
And what you mean by variable for the San Andreas is that you identified 100 wells across the field, the entire model area, that you've assigned a variable vertical permeability for at the location of wells, allowing water to come up from the San Andreas into the Grayberg. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you've done so through a variable permeability value that you've tweaked to match your model, correct?
That was to match the water rates on the individual wells. And if I run the model without that, you'll see that we can't even make the historical water rates on any of these wells,
Okay.
or most of these wells, I would say.
And we talked earlier about you were given a range of permeability and porosity values, and you told me that the permeability, I think, was on the range of 10 to 20 millidarcies. Is that right?
I think I've seen that, like in some of the documents I looked at historically.
Okay, but on the other table over here to the left, you've used a mix depending on the layer. In the Penrose, you used a constant porosity, correct?
Correct.
And then the San Andreas used a constant porosity.
Correct.
But in the Grayberg, you had a variable porosity, correct?
I sure did. That's where I did a lot of work and used kriging to create a variable porosity field to allow me to match the oil, water, gas, and the fluid moving around as well.
So as to the Grayberg, you've got variable porosity,
Correct?
but you've got constant permeability as to each layer, correct? With respect to each layer.
Yes, we have constant permeability there,
Okay.
at least in the layers 3 and 4, and then I think a little lower in 5, 6, 7.
Yeah. So in other words, like layer 3, permeability is constant, right? But it has a variable porosity.
Correct, and that's true of all the layers.
Yeah. Each layer has a constant permeability, but a variable porosity.
Yeah, I wish I'd brought the map so you could see the porosity map, but I'd get in trouble if I did that. So,
Well, now only because we hadn't seen it. So is it normal for geologic systems, not talking modeled geologic systems, I'm talking about real world geology for formations to have variable porosity, but constant permeability?
let me explain why we have constant permeability. The goal was to create a permeability high enough where we can make all the historical rates for production and injection. So that's why we put that in there. Reality is the real world is going to have less permeability in some areas and higher than others. But for the purpose of this model and the field-wide match, we're just looking at field withdrawals and so forth, and it worked quite well.
Did so just to be clear, you didn't yourself look at the core, there's some core data for the Grayberg. You didn't look at the core data, for example, to determine what would be appropriate for the
That
Grayberg.
wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. If you look at the core data, it's 10 to 20 millidarcies. It's essentially a composite rock. It's got the dolomite matrix in the fracture. So what we're seeing here is a high enough effective permeability of that combined system to represent the fluid flow properly.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I'm going to pull up a new exhibit. This is, may I please move the admission of this exhibit Goodnight.
You misspelled my name there, by the way.
I'm sorry. It wasn't me. That's not right.
Okay, I'm not going to blame you.
But I didn't catch it. So that's my fault. I will correct it before we submit it.
That's okay. Everybody spells my name that way. So.
Yeah, no, I apologize for not catching it. It was, it should be Goodnight Cross exhibit number 6.
Any objection from Empire?
To this specific exhibit?
Yes.
No.
OCD,
No objection, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice,
No objection.
Pilot,
No objection.
all right, it'll be admitted.
Dr. Buckwalter, you just were telling me that you understood the core perms to be between 10 to 20 millidarcies, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I saw. I'd never seen this, but I just saw in some write-ups that said.
So you were given ranges from Empire, but you didn't yourself look at any of the core data showing what the potential ranges of permeability would be in the Grayberg, correct?
No, I mean, the goal was to create a model that fits the field production and pressures and leaks. So it was never the intent to build all these little details in here because it wouldn't change the answer.
Okay.
On a field-wide basis.
Thank you. Going back to my my exhibit 6, my cross exhibit number 6. Yeah. Did I move this one? Okay. Mr. Hearing Officer, I'm going to label what's I'm going to mark as Goodnight Cross exhibit number 7, which is it's actually 2 pages of core data on permeability that was provided to us by Empire, and it's Bates labeled ENM OCD 23614-17 Bates 244 to 245.
There's hardly any objection.
Well, I don't know exactly what this is. And I mean, I don't object to the exhibit. I don't know how he's going to use it with Mr. Buckwalter, and I don't know if Dr. Buckwalter's.
Could I ask a question? I guess it's not appropriate, but could I ask a question?
Sure.
You got 638 wells here. This is just one well.
Correct. Yeah.
So if you look at a real reservoir, it's like the people in this room. That's how much, well, a lot more if we had 638 people in this room. That's the kind of variability you get from one spot to another. This is like turning the lights off in the Superdome, going in with a flashlight and looking at what the Superdome looks like. You might see a seat, you might see the field, you might see something else. But you're trying to take the big picture and now look at it with a microscope, and that isn't. You can do that, but
All right, well,
Okay.
getting back to the objection. I take it Empire objects, OCD,
No objection, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice,
No objection.
Pilot.
No objection.
I think based on the witness's answer, this goes to the weight, not the admissibility. It'll be admitted.
Let's see. So on our Goodnight cross number 6, I'm interested now I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the San Andreas in particular. In the San Andreas, you've assigned a value of 250 millidarcies for the horizontal permeability, right?
that is correct.
And in your testimony and earlier today, you discussed with me the fact that, as injection at high rates occurs within the San Andreas, you're seeing in your model results an increase buildup of pressure as a result of that high rate of injection, correct?
That is correct.
And is that not partly a function of the permeability you've assigned to the cells in and around where Goodnight's injection is occurring?
Yes, I mean we assigned this permeability, and it fit the pressures in 1986 and the current pressure in the San Andreas.
Have you been provided the daily injection data from Goodnight Midstream that they produced to Empire in this case?
I've been provided data. I believe it was monthly up until 1/1/24. So that would be all the forecasts are as of, I believe, at that date. So
Have you been provided the injection pressures and the pressure data on Goodnight's injection wells that they have produced to Empire?
I have not, no. But my understanding is a lot of the wells are taking water on vacuum.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true.
So here is Goodnight's Exhibit B12 from Mr. Preston McGuire's testimony. It shows I think it's like over 100,000 data points from its SOSA well. And it shows on the bottom, on the x-axis is the instantaneous injection rate as barrels of water per day. And on the y-axis, it shows the tubing pressure, okay? So what it's showing here, if you look to the right, is, above 40,000 barrels per day. It's consistently under 80 PSI. It's a low pressure. Do you agree, Dr. Buckwalter?
That appears to be what I'm seeing, yes.
Do the permeability values that you've included and assigned to the San Andreas allow for this high rate of injection at that low of an tubing pressure?
I would love to put tubing curves in there and tell you what happened.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have to build the tubing curve. There's some friction associated with it as well. So I'd have to build the tubing curve and just put it in and see what happened. But I did not have this information.
Okay. And in your deposition, you told me that when you do models for clients, you ask the client for all the data that they have that would best describe the reservoir. And you said the data would include the geology, it include production and pressure records, it includes well test and fluid data. This is the kind of data that would help you build a more accurate model. Agree?
Well, it would especially help in doing forecasts. If we're doing the history match, we actually know the volumes that go in the wells. So, knowing tubing, usually you put the tubing head pressure when you do forecasts, so you can forecast with that tubing curve how things are going to change in the future. We know what the individual injection rates are on each of these saltwater disposal wells. So we just use that data directly. And that's typically the way you do a history match. Is you put the tubing curves when maybe you want to run some forecasts. So
I'm going to go back to your direct testimony and just kind of sorting through some of the assumptions and inputs. Let's see. I must not have highlighted this portion. Sorry. Well, it didn't pop up. Oh, I know. Maybe it's in rebuttal. PDF 6. Apologize. 1 second. Yeah. Okay. This is your rebuttal exhibit M, and it's towards the bottom of page 6. You say that all the Grayburg water injectors, these would be the water flood injectors, injected into all the layers of the Grayburg interval. And this is the assumption used in the model. So just going back to your our cross exhibit number 5, I believe, where I've showed the model layers against Dr. Lindsay's layers. As I understand that statement that you're showing in your model or have input in your model that the Grayburg water flood injectors are injecting across layers 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, correct?
I believe that's correct. I had to
Okay.
double check the model, but I believe that's the way I set it up.
But in reality, the Grayburg injectors were injecting into specific intervals, targeted
Right.
intervals across the Grayburg. Is that your understanding based on the testimony you heard this week?
That's is my understanding.
Okay. Okay. Now, for Goodnight's injection wells, as I understand it, you've got it set up so that Goodnight's injection wells, the injection interval is from the very top of the 8th layer all the way through the base of the St. Andrews, correct?
I believe that is the way I set it up. We're
Okay.
injecting all the layers.
So you heard testimony this week about how Empire has divided the San Andreas into upper San Andreas and lower San Andreas?
Correct.
And did you hear testimony this week addressing how there's a composite sequence boundary between the upper San Andreas and lower San Andreas?
Object, I'm not sure that that's actually,
We don't entertain tentative objection.
well,
I mean, the question's harmless enough.
well, that's fine, but I think it's just, it's lack of foundation for this witness.
Well,
It's,
Uh,
beyond the scope of this.
It isn't yet. Hold your objection, Ms. Hardy. We'll see where we're going.
Well, I mean, I have a seal between the Grayburg and the San Andreas, and then I put water into the San Andreas itself, and that's the way I've constructed the model. I have vertical permeability, even if it's, some of these are just saltwater disposal wells injected into part of the San Andreas, that's fine too, because I've got this vertical permeability and everything's going to equilibrate out. So whether I inject in the top or the 2/3, the whole thing, at the end of the day, since there's vertical communication, it's basically the pressure is going to be more or less the same everywhere.
I guess my question though is, did you hear Empire's witnesses this week testify that there's a composite sequence boundary that divides the upper San Andreas, what they call the upper San Andreas from the lower San Andreas?
I mean, I'm just saying this fits the model, and this is what I was given.
Okay. Did you yourself evaluate or determine Goodnight's injection intervals in its disposal wells?
No, I did not.
Okay.
I just injected into the San Andreas.
Okay. So as you sit here, you're not sure, you can't tell me whether it's a fair representation based on Empire's San Andreas pick, where it's a fair representation that they're actually injecting at the very top of the San Andreas based on Empire's pick for the top of the San Andreas?
What I can say is where I'm injecting water and the way I've got the San Andreas set up, we can fit the injection rates and we can fit the historical pressures that we have in the San Andreas in 1986 and currently. So, we're fitting the model. I suppose you could fit this in a variety of different ways, but in terms of you think the aquifer is incompressible fluid, the pressure waves moves very quickly up and down, where underneath the Grayberg, where you really see the big pressure differences in San Andreas is as you move out that 33 miles. So you could set it up differently, but a little different. You could set the San Andreas up differently. I could say it's thinner and I have a higher porosity. It's the same answer, basically. So
I guess, Dr. Buckwalter, if Empire is testifying and its experts are testifying that there's a composite sequence boundary that divides the San Andreas into an upper and a lower, and you didn't confirm yourself whether Goodnight's injection wells are injecting into the above or below that composite sequence boundary, wouldn't you want to know that fact?
let me say what I would do if Empire had put this in the original model and how I would match it. I'd increase the porosity to where essentially all the production or all the oil, water we have in 8, 9, 10 is now above that line there. And, we get it all to fit. It'd be a little different aquifer description, but it would all fit. Instead of being 1,100 feet thick, 1,700 feet thick, whatever it is, it would now be maybe 300 or 400 feet thick and would have a higher porosity. But, it's all going to fit because it's the one thing that is somewhat of a material balance. Well, it's not a material balance everywhere in the aquifer, but underneath the St. Andrews, essentially it is a material balance because water is an incompressible fluid. Anywhere you put water in this area, the pressure is going to be almost the same underneath the Grayberg. So yeah, that would be a different geological interpretation. But at the end of the day, we'd end up with the same model because we need the same volume of water to fit the pressures. We need the same oil, water, gas in the model, and we need the same leak. So, you can change these tops. You can do whatever you want. I would come up with a history match that would still be virtually the same because we have to hit match volumes and pressures.
But as we sit here, you don't know whether there is a composite sequence boundary that divides the upper San Andreas from the lower San Andreas.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not the geologist and I don't know that stuff.
And you don't know whether that composite sequence boundary serves as a pressure barrier between the upper and lower San Andreas, correct?
Well, as I said,
I object to the witness continually being asked questions that are outside the scope of his testimony. These are geology issues that have been addressed by Empire's geology witnesses.
I'm going to allow it just in the interest of thoroughness. I mean, a lot of it may have been beyond the limited scope of your direct exam, but we've already set a precedent that doesn't seem to matter here. So,
well, it does matter.
well, like I said, it will not change the ultimate model.
Doctor, you cannot answer. Let them finish, please.
Sorry.
I realize that you are tired and I realize you have a flight. And I'm going to interrupt right now. What time is your flight, doctor?
It's 4:45.
What airport are you flying out of?
This one.
Santa Fe.
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
gonna be easy to get
So for the sake of time, for the good doctor, we are going to have to make sure that we keep this up. We can always make sure that we bring him back on the platform when we come back on, because the poor man this will be the second time with his flight. So I want to be cognizant of that, please.
Thank you.
Doctor, sorry, but we do need to wait till the objections are answered.
Correct. I'm sorry. Apologize.
Empire, please make sure that your witnesses understand there's decorum.
Yes.
I mentioned it the other day. We need to make sure that we have decorum in here. So please make sure that, and it applies for both sides.
Understood.
it's partly my fault. I don't speak that fast. So when somebody jumps in ahead of me, that's pretty easy to do, but it'll be overruled. But Mr. Rankin, please try and be cognizant of at least the spirit of Ms. Hardy's objections, not to mention Dr. Burke Walter's constraints.
Yeah, just for context, I won't belabor the point. I'll move on quickly. I only have I have one more line of questioning to address. Dr. Buckwalter testified that the number 2 important input in his model is geology. And I know he's relying entirely on what was provided to him by Empire, and I get that. And I guess I'm just trying to ascertain what the effect of additional geologic information that he wasn't provided would have on his model. So that was the point of the questioning. Okay. With that, I'll move on. In your rebuttal exhibit, Dr. Buckwalter, you did identify, as we discussed, you did a model with the Grayberg and an aquifer attached to the west side of the Grayberg. I believe this was the field-wide match for that model run, correct?
I believe that's correct.
So
Yeah.
this is your exhibit M14. And it looked, I think you said so in your summary, that it was a pretty good on a field-wide basis, a pretty good match when you allowed for the Grayberg to have an aquifer that connected to the west, correct?
Correct.
Okay. But then when you went and looked at the group of down dip wells, you said that it showed that there was not a good match as to that group, correct?
That's correct. It's the wells that are shaded in the yellow area.
Okay. And that the basis for that was that you were saying that the western edge wells were watering out too quickly, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Isn't the problem with the western wells in your model just due to the failure to incorporate the full complexities of the geology within the Grayberg? Couldn't that be a reason that these wells are watering out too quickly in your model?
No, it's not. And it's not possible because we basically attached a aquifer with the same properties as the Grayberg extending west. That's all we know. And there's no way it's ever going to fit. It's an edge water drive aquifer plus a small amount of water coming up from the bottom. I know there's some dispute as how much water is under the Grayberg, but that's not enough water to yield 159 billion barrels or whatever it's going to take coming up from the bottom, because that would extend into what's actually the St. Andrews. So what that shows is that, technically, if the water was coming in from the Grayberg aquifer to the west, we would be able to match these wells because we.
On the grouping question, did you, especially as to this model run here, did you group just the EMSU to see what the effect was on the down dip wells?
I grouped all the wells, but if I just group the MSU, it's the same answer.
Like, the reason I'm asking you is because in this slide number 5, that was part of your opening presentation, your water to oil ratio was higher in the area of the AGU than it on the western edge than it appears to be in the EMSU. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if you were to just group the EMSU, in other words, when I look at your rebuttal here, my understanding, based on your prior testimony, is that you've allowed the fluids to flow between all 3 units, correct?
Correct.
So if you had, in order to make up the differences, you allowed water to flow between the units. And if I'm looking at your presentation from yesterday morning, I'm wondering how it would look if you were to actually just group the EMSU by itself based on the fact that the AGU is where it looks like a lot of the western edge water oil ratio is high.
I'd have to do it. I wish I could go get my computer and I could do it for you, but I guess it's a little too late to do that. But I think we show pretty much the same thing. It's the curve itself is very high. If you look, we're almost twice as much water as And here's the other thing, Adam, I think that you're missing. If the water's coming in from the edge, you don't have hardly enough water on the bottom. So how did all those high water ratios end up in those up-dip wells that are, you've got wells that are, almost 600 feet of pay down to the oil water contact that show 13-to-1 water ratio. At the same time, we've got wells that are only, 60 to 100 feet above the original oil water contact that never saw water. So, and the one thing you can clearly see as far as the EMSU is concerned, just from this graph, you can clearly see that the water in the EMSU, if there's any small amount of aquifer support, yes, it is a little more in the south, but in terms of the EMSUB and the EMSU, it certainly shows that wasn't what was happening, that it doesn't.
Last question, Dr. Buckwalter. I mean, you're going to disagree with me, I guess, but it seems from my perspective that the goal of this model was to establish what the volumes were coming up from the San Anderson to the Grayburg, and not whether there was some other possible solution for the water production in the Grayburg wells.
That's not.
I don't hear a question in there. It was a statement by Mr. Rankin, not a question.
I think the witness interpreted it as a question.
Well, that's just not correct. All the evidence shows that there's no way that Grayburg could have a huge aquifer coming into this reservoir.
Okay.
The water has to come from the bottom. And this figure, if anyone looks at this figure and analyzes it, will come to the same conclusion.
No further questions, Mr. Hearing Officer, at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Pass it to OCD and Mr. Molinder.
OCD does not have any questions for this witness. Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Mr. Beck for Rice.
Nope, no questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Swanzo for Pilot.
No questions for this witness.
All right, Mr. Chairman, commission questions.
I do have a few questions, and thank you for your patience, Doctor. We appreciate it. Miss Hardy, if I could get you please to share with us, first off, back up. Can we admit the slides, your full slideshow from yesterday, the doctor's slideshow? Mr. Rankin has asked the witness about it. We haven't seen those slides, so some of this information was passed us. So if we could get that admitted at some point, if someone would please move to enter it.
I would so move.
Okay.
I
Mr.
guess,
Hearing Officer.
well, I just want to make sure the record's clear. My notes show that Mr. Rankin went over slide 4 and slide 10. Is that what you're asking to admit, or more than that?
Good. Mr. Rankin.
Yeah, thank you. I was sensitive to Mr. Harwood's admonition that the slides I addressed were the slides, that would be relevant and admitted. So I will just I addressed this, I guess, just going in sequence. It's this first introduction slide, which I think is slide 2. And I'm just going to address the slides that were not previously in exhibit. So it was slide 2, slide 5, I think slide 10, and I believe that was it. Yeah, that was it. Just those are the slides that I addressed that were not previously an exhibit.
Mr. Examiner, if I can respond, I would like to.
Well, sure, let's make a record.
Okay, and I think that the presentation is a comprehensive presentation, and the slides that were included but not referenced by Mr. Rankin as well are part of the explanation. And I think that under the doctrine of completeness, that the entire presentation should be admitted, and the commission can give it what weight it decides to do so.
Well, my notes show slides 4 and 10 were discussed on cross-examination. So what I'm hearing is a proposal, at least my understanding is nobody would object if slides 2, 4, 5, and 10 were admitted. Is that correct, Mr. Rankin?
2, 4, 5, and 10. Based on my pagination, I would not object.
And but Mr. Rosatos, are you, is it the commission's pleasure that they all be admitted?
I'm okay to leave it the way, I would like to see the ones that were discussed today. So I definitely, whatever was missing and was discussed today, I would like to see.
Okay, so my understanding is the request is that slides 2, 4, 5, and 10 be admitted. Any objection from a Goodnight?
Not to those slides, Mr. Hearing Officer, and I would just kind of qualify what my position is that if it's a previously admitted slide, if it's an exhibit, if a slide is an exhibit that was part of Dr. Buckwalter's testimony, I don't object to it being presented. But if it wasn't previously presented and I didn't use it for cross, then I wouldn't want it to be admitted as part of the record.
Okay, and I think that means slides 2, 4, 5, and 10.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. OCD, any objection to those?
No, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice,
No objection to those slides.
Pilot.
No objections.
Okay, those will be admitted. Ms. Hardy, your argument that they should all be admitted is rejected. I think you cited the rule of completeness, which has to do basically with singular documents involving, when one party offers up a portion of a document, the other has the right to request the remainder be admitted. That doesn't really apply here because all of these slides cover different information and categories. So just for the record, that's rejected, but those 4 will be admitted. Sorry?
Can you put it on the microphone, please?
Mr. Hearing Officer, I guess the question is, should we mark those as a Empire exhibit? We can do it as a Goodnight Cross number 8.
Whatever works.
Yeah, we'll do it as Goodnight Cross 8. I'll confer with Ms. Hardy. We'll put it together as a Goodnight Cross number 8.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now I think we're back to you, Mr. Rosatos.
Yes.
The questions.
Thank you. Ms. Hardy, if you wouldn't mind pulling up your exhibit M6, please. Perfect. Thank you. Dr. Buckwalter, again, thank you for your testimony and your patience with us today. The question I had, you stated here that you did the math at a 4 PSI. The paper that you referenced then at the bottom that you said kind of correlates with what you say is 4 to 10 PSI, and you've mentioned the range of 4 to 10 PSI as well. For someone who is definitely not educated in this, what would happen if the pressure went up to 10 PSI? What are we looking at potentially in these models?
Okay, so excuse me, I was talking to you, but not the microphone.
No worries.
So what happens is if you have 10 PSI buildup, that probably means a time at which the saltwater injection is higher.
Okay.
And because all that water can't move out immediately, it builds up the pressure higher in that area. Whereas a 4 PSI might either be a better permeability area where the water can dissipate faster, or alternatively just a higher injection rate. But I just thought it was really neat that these numbers quoted here match the physics that we were coming out of the model, and this came after the fact. So
Okay. Excellent. A second thing that you mentioned was when the water hits a pseudo steady state, and the pressure is increasing, you stated that the water will go up into the Grayberg. Could this potentially also go down? I typed all of this. I apologize. I was typing as you were talking.
It could. I guess it could go down someplace else, but I don't know the geology. Is there something other St. Andreas where it could go?
I don't know. I'm asking with your models.
Well, with the model, it's basically, if you kind of think of the St. Andreas Reservoir, the water there underneath the Grayberg, think of it just as a big tank.
Uh-huh.
I wish I could have had another figure added that actually showed how the pressure changes in the Grayberg. And it's really cool because what you see, because it's not intuitive really what's happening here, but up until now, most of that water has been injected, has also been produced. And at the same time, in the future, potentially we're going to increase this injection rate, and we're not producing that water anymore. So what you find is very quickly the pressure here that you're seeing here, right underneath the Grayberg in the St. Andreas, it builds up very quickly to about 2,700 psi. And as I said earlier, the real problem with this is these saltwater disposal wells are just all kind of in one place. And this aquifer goes out 33 miles. So what happens once it hits that 2,700 pounds, I have a 3,000 maximum injection pressure. So you can't inject any more water after that point. So with or without the new saltwater disposal wells, you essentially have, after that point, the same physics. So that you have about the same water going in, and there's only two places the water can go. It can go up, or it can go out into the aquifer. And essentially, at that point, what you're injecting levels out. And at the same time, because we're essentially, the way I operate the Grayberg in the future is we're going to assume all the producing wells can operate at low pressure. So the pressure in Grayberg stays about the same. Does that make sense if you're producing them? So as more water comes out, we're just lifting more water. And so essentially the pressure in the two places are stay about the same after that point, and you have about the same pressure difference. So from that point on, we're at about 50,000 barrels of water moving up, and the remainder water moves sideways. So essentially like what we call pseudo steady state. Did I explain that, or?
I think I understood you. Thank you. Appreciate it. The next slide, Ms. Hardy, if you could, this was one of those that were not shown to it. That one right there, the relative permeability curve. If you could do me a favor, Doctor, and just describe what we're looking here, and what exactly you would like the commission to see off of this.
Okay. In a perfect world, you create what's called a dual porosity model. In other words, you have a different set of relative permeabilities, which essentially says that the fluids flow differently in the fractures versus the rock. Does that make sense? Think of the fractures as a pipe. So the fluid just shoots through there. So those relative permeability curves typically are just straight lines, as they would even in a flow line, essentially. In the rock, we have these relative permeability curves where the fluids interfere with one another, and you see what you've seen here. And I think I explained this to Adam earlier. So in a perfect world, you'd have all this core, you do all this fracture analysis, and you create what's called a dual porosity model. And in that dual porosity model, I've built these all around the world. Once you have that information, the way you represent each grid block that might be 300 feet by 300 feet is, imagine a bunch of little cubes. Each one of those cubes represents the average dolomite block that's surrounded by fractures. And of course, if those blocks are this big, there's not a whole lot of communication with the fractures, right? Because that water's going to shoot through the fractures. If they're this big, think of all the cross-sectional area that these blocks have. So in a traditional dual porosity simulator, if you can build it and you have the data, then essentially you have this is of course, I didn't have we just didn't have that data. So what we do when we don't have all that detailed data on the block sizes is we try to find a composite rock that represents the combined matrix blocks of dolomite and the fractures. And these relative permeability curves represent that. So in the big picture, if you think of it, really the flow is going through the fractures. That's where all the flow is. So these relative permeability curves that you see here are somewhat straight, like that bottom curve. And even the water curve up here on top is relatively linear, more linear than it would be in a normal rock. But at the same time, what we do is we adjust the residual saturation so it corresponds to what you would see in the rock itself, because 95% of the oil and water gas is in the rock itself. It's not in the fractures, it's just small volume. So big picture, this is the way you create a composite relative permeability curve that does the same thing as the dual porosity. In fact, the next slide I had in here was, it said up on top, it was a dual porosity physics. And because we don't have dual porosity, it wasn't even something that was applicable to this reservoir or the history match or anything else. I wanted to explain why these curves look the way they do, because they're not what you would normally think of for a dolomite.
Okay.
Is that okay? Or?
Yes, you answered my question. Thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate it. I don't have any other questions.
I think I'll pass it to Dr. Ambuma. I think he's got a plethora of questions for you.
He's going to have lots of questions. This is going to be fun.
Thank you, doctor. And if I may be reminded, your flight is...
I've probably got a good 35 minutes. You can ask lots of questions. 35 minutes.
Probably 35 minutes might not be enough, but
I hope. Well,
yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Rankin did, he asked most of my questions that I do have. I mean, going through, when I reviewed the testimony, I was able to follow it, but the problem is I don't have the input data, to be able to verify. But going through the cross, most of my questions have been answered, but I do still have a couple. And we will start from here. So, did you use the same relative perm for the Greenberg and then the San Andreas?
Did I use the same? What was it?
Relative perm, like you're showing right here.
Yeah, I think I used the same relative perm curves. But basically, in the San Andreas, we're on the endpoint of that water curve there, more or less. Or maybe not, because I didn't have any mobile oil in the San Andreas. They were both 30% though, right? Let's see. Yeah, it's the same KR curves.
The same curve you use for both?
Yeah, I use the same KR curves.
But did you put in the saturation distribution within the San Andreas?
Yes, I did. I put in the saturate. I essentially created a saturation distribution where 30%, and I rolled it down until we had the 900 million barrels in place, raws in the San Andreas.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we look at this curve, let's say initial water saturation right on the top is about, let's say 35%. And the critical water saturation is about just probably 40%, right? So not much room there. Immediately you start producing, water is going to come out. Is that a fair statement?
You're referring to what, the San Andreas?
Okay, this curve, let's just focus on the Greenberg for a moment. With this curve that you have,
right,
your initial water saturation about 35%, and the critical water saturation is about 40%. Is that correct?
When you say critical water saturation, you're referring to?
I'm referring to the minimum amount of water saturation that it will start to move.
Yeah, it's basically, it's 35%. Yes, exactly. I think of it as the connate water saturation. So anything above 30. Well, I must have used a different KR curve because maybe I initialized the St. Andrews a little differently. I just know I initialized it so the oil would not move. The oil was essentially immobile.
Now, let's focus on the reservoir itself, the Greenberg Reservoir.
The Grayberg.
Yeah, the Greenberg.
Okay,
yeah.
the Grayberg we're talking about now. Okay, I'm
Yes.
sorry.
So should I repeat my question one more time?
Yeah, repeat it one more time because I was thinking in terms of St. Andrews. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to focus on the Greenberg for quite a number of questions. So I'm saying that your initial water saturation right here on the top curve, that is the oil and then the water curve. Initial
Right.
water saturation is 35%.
Absolutely.
Your critical water saturation is 40%. Is that a fair description?
How do you define critical water saturation? It's essentially the waters varies between that. It starts to move at 30% oil saturation. And once we hit the 21% residual oil saturation, the oil stops moving and the water curve goes up to 0.8. Does that make sense?
So you're saying that even the critical water saturation is 35%?
Well, the initial, what I call connate water saturation or immobile water saturation in the rock is 35%. And as the oil curve goes down, eventually we go to the point where we hit the residual oil saturation with respect to water, which is 21%. And that's where the oil curve hits 0 and the water curve hits 0.8. Does that make sense?
No, I got what you mean. Connate water is not going to move. But at what saturation is the water going to start to move?
The water's going to start to move at that 30% per that curve, right?
Yeah, so if 30%, then it means we don't have any connate water. I mean, your connate water is 35, meaning at 35, water is not going to move, stack.
Yeah,
The water has to increase at a certain point. So you produce oil, and then the oil saturation will reduce. And at some
Right.
point, the water has to start moving. At what saturation level will the water start to move?
Well, the water's starting to move at that 30%, as you see on the curve there. Does that make sense? Just kind of look at the curve itself.
Okay.
It is I may be misstating, but connate water is the water saturation that's imbibed in the rock that doesn't move.
And that is 35.
No, it's 30. It's 35. You're right. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought it was 30. It's 35, so the water starts to move at 35. Duh. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I was thinking it was 30, but it's 35.
It does make sense to me.
I was looking at the wrong number.
That
Here.
sounds
It was
like
30 in the report, right?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time. So, but so if you look at the margin between, let's say, 40% water saturation to about, let's say, 78% water saturation,
Correct.
it tells you that water flood was quite successful. About would you agree with me on that?
You would think so, but the other thing you're not thinking about is the fact that this water KR curve is very almost linear compared to a normal Corey exponent curve for a dolomite. So essentially what I did is conceptually it would seem right? It seemed a lot of oil is mobile, but the reality is because these curves are so flat and they increase so quickly, the net result is we end up with a good history match of the historical of the water. I wish I could bring my computer up here and just show you a typical set of Corey KR curves between these 2 points. And but this curve is very, very optimistic. It's not quite linear. Obviously if it's flow in fractures, it would be linear, right? It's not quite that, but it's approaching that. And essentially, I varied the exponent on these curves until I could fit the historical water and oil production. For example, right now, these wells are making an extremely high water oil ratio. So,
Dr. Ampoma, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that we'll be sure that Dr. Buckwalter is able to get home. So
yeah,
just take your time with your questions, please.
yeah,
Okay,
just take your
okay.
time.
So I don't
I'm going
rush.
to answer
I
your
appreciate it.
questions. And I apologize for the misunderstanding. I kept thinking it was 30, and it was 35. You kept answering the same question.
Yeah.
So that's my fault. I apologize.
So, just what I just want to point out here, in the report, on the left, residual oil saturation, which I presume saturation at, let's say, residual oil saturation at water injection
Right,
is 25%.
right. What's cited in the report, I'm using, I think, 21%, right?
Well, I'm looking at the actual 1990 report.
Correct.
No, not necessarily the model. The way I look at this is I feel like we have to use the actual field data, to help us to be able to understand what is going on. I mean, doctor, you know that there's no way a dolomite reservoir is going to have a permeability of like 500 millidarcy. I mean, sandstones even probably, I don't know if there is that in America here. I mean, the input data that you use for the model, I'm just trying to.
So you're trying to get your head around why did I use such a high permeability? It's because we've got fractures. That fracture network is increasing. If I put a permeability anywhere close to what a dolomite is, it will never history match. I mean, I started with that and I could only make a small fraction of the cumulative oil. I couldn't even get the water in the ground really. So I literally, what's happening here is I think essentially in a dual porosity system, the effective permeability is a composite of the fractures in the matrix. And this permeability I put in here was necessary before I could even get a fit.
So,
I mean, I'm kind of with you. I didn't start there, but that's where I had to end up.
So are you saying that all the testimony that we've listened to, is it your testimony that the Greenberg is a highly fractured reservoir?
Mine or, yeah, well, I just, it seems to be. I mean, that's what fits the production.
I mean, I don't know if I can agree or disagree with you, but I mean, what I was expecting is that with all the geology description that we've seen, probably throughout the whole week, they've given us porosity maps, permeability maps, and even there is a core data for the KV, versus even there is a correlation between porosity permeability. So I thought that probably that was what was used in the model. And if you use that, and then you are able to go through all these scenarios that was described here, I mean, probably we will not be here by now. But with these, there are a lot of uncertainties associated with the model that you presented here today.
Yeah, let me expand on that a little bit. This is a permeability that was required so I could match the field oil, water, gas rates and injection rates. So, obviously there's going to be a lot of places in this reservoir that are tighter. But the goal of this model was try to come up with a match of field production, injection, pressures, and then the influx, match that influx from the St. Andrews. So you are right. Big picture is if you go into any one spot of this reservoir, you could find some lower permeabilities. And maybe, if you were doing a detailed model and it would take a long time, you could add those additional details in there. But for the purpose of this model, we were just trying to match the field volumes, and this allowed me to match the field volumes. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, the way the model is set up, is easy for everybody to argue that this is not based on actual field data. You talk about there are fractures. to be able to match, but I've not seen anywhere where you've developed, let's say, a fracture model. And throughout the whole week, I've not had anybody talking about the properties of the fractures that we're seeing in the 649 or the other wells, the two wells. You know, I've not had any fracture properties that were described to really tell the commission that the Greenberg is really a highly fractured reservoir. So if you thought that it was a highly fractured reservoir, then probably you should have straight away gone into like a dual porosity model. And even how do you even estimate the fracture networks, the type of fractures here and there? I mean, limited data, but to assume that the entire Greenberg formation is a fractured reservoir, that's
Okay, can I explain what
Yes,
my
sir.
workflow? My workflow is, here's the problem if you go straight into dual porosity model. You have twice as many perms. You've got two sets of relative permeability. You've got two sets of porosities. Granted, the porosity of fractures is small, and two sets of permeability. And the hardest thing is figuring out what that matrix block size is in the dual porosity model. So the way I approach simulation, I had a slide on this, but I can't show you, but I'll talk through it, is I first create a single porosity model to figure out what the effective permeability and porosity is of the composite fractures and matrix. And that gives me my first step, because until I get that, I've got so many unknowns, I'm never going to get my head wrapped around the solution. So once I've got that single porosity model, at that point, if we didn't have a detailed frac study here and core study to tell me what those block sizes are. So I mean, I could start with any block size. It could be an inch, a foot, whatever. But I don't have that data. So I mean, I had to use this approach, and it did eventually fit the pressures and volumes and so forth. But if we had that data, the next step in this model, I just said, would be create a dual porosity model. And at that point, we could have some idea what those block sizes are. And the big advantage of those matrix blocks, Doctor, is that you have both a gravity and capillary contribution and different relative permeabilities, right? So kind of what we do here is kind of it's a simple approach. It's not perfect. But what you see here are relatively straight line or linear relative permeability curves to model flow as would be in the fractures, and adjust those residual saturations to represent the type of rock in the matrix. But within the time constraints, and really the goal of this model was more than anything else to start to understand this leak, this potential leak between the Grayburg and the San Andreas. And ultimately, we fit all the production. We fit the historical pressures in the San Andreas, and we fit the historical pressures at 1986 and today. And that's, I mean, honestly, if this was a model that was designed to figure out where to infill drill wells and things like that, and this was a young reservoir, then you would do that additional work. You create that dual porosity model, and the main advantage of that dual porosity model, as I said, is you'll have two sets of relative perm curves, and you'll also have that gravity and capillary pressure contribution as well. But honestly, there's just so many buttons to twist in the real world. You can't do everything at once. I like to say you can't eat the elephant all at once. It's just one little bite at a time. So,
let's say as we reservoir simulators, simulation experts, as you said, we can give any much. I mean, we can have multiple reservoir engineers in the room, and we can all come up with the same match, but with different approaches, but still the underlying geology needs to still be more or less inherent in anything that we do. You talk about, once you set the model, I presume you use the oil constraint or liquid constraint, oil and gas as your primary constraint.
I use oil constraints on these wells.
So you were able to match, I mean, you were able to get all the, let's say the oil to match and the gas to match and even some pressures, except only the water production. Is that correct?
Yeah, in the original model, I actually could get the oil and gas to match, but not the water. You could see the water was falling short. It's from 1938, you could see it was short to 1986. And even from 1986 to 2004, you could see how that difference was increased, and there were still some shortcomings.
So it was more or less predominantly the water that has some issues. Now, let me ask you, how accurate is the water production history?
How good is the water production history?
No, the historical data.
As good as what they gave me. I mean, I've got the data. At the end of the day, you and I both know the model's as good as the data you put in, right? And so that's all we've got to work with. And the thing I would say, I was surprised it fit as well as it did, because as you said, oftentimes you don't have accurate records there, but I put everything in and it just seemed to fit. Especially when I put the first time as I said, I built this model, I couldn't get a match, and I wasn't going to be here. I told that to Empire, and they identified these missing saltwater disposal wells. I put that in, and once I put those in, prior to that, the match model only had about half the saltwater disposal wells on, and as soon as I did that, everything just kind of fit, which I thought was. It's either really lucky or just we had the right model. I think it was the right model.
Yeah, so if you can make the responses really, sleepy a little bit, so we can get through most of the questions here. So let's say, which year did the water production started?
The water production
history, yeah.
The history? Well, the history started in 1938. So from 1938 to the time the water flood commenced in 1987, then we had no water flood. From 1987 to today, we've water flooded the reservoir.
Yeah, but I'm just asking, in some of your plots, it sounds like water production started right from the start of, let's say, the commencement of oil production.
Yes, it did. Absolutely.
So definitely there is some kind of water drive somewhere.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, if you just put the Grayberg in there, as I've said, you can have a little bit of water in the Grayberg itself underneath the oil water contact going down to the San Andreas. And in addition to that, you have to put an aquifer out, Edgewater Drive aquifer out to the west. And you can come up with a good match of oil, water, gas. But the problem is when you start to look at wells in the area, if you look at all the down dip wells, historically during primary production, they didn't make much water, very little water. So the only way that water can come, there's not enough water down dip. If it comes in from the edge, it waters out the deeper wells in the Grayberg, and that's just not what happened. You can look at that figure where you can see wells that are 0 to 60 feet or so, term above down to the oil water contact. Many of those wells produce virtually no water. And here's a well over here at 600 feet down to the oil water contact. It's making a 13-to-1 cumulative water oil ratio at the time water injected commenced. So, I mean, it's not consistent unless we have a large aquifer coming in from the bottom. At the same time, that aquifer is not coming in everywhere. You can see the cumulative water oil ratio map in 1986 shows that water's preferentially just coming in at a select fraction of the wells.
Doctor, so once we start producing and then water start coming up, then definitely it means that we do not have connate water within the reservoir.
Correct.
It's open to, let's say, water production. Now, it struck me a lot during the cross that I got to know that you did not really revisit the completion data. I mean, if you have extremely high water producing wells I thought probably you might want to check the records to look at the completion and see probably they might have completed, or let's say the oil water contact might have moved and they are producing a lot of water. Did that assessment?
That's a fair criticism. Yeah, I could have improved the model, but overall with 638 wells, I think the conclusion remains the same. Just a small fraction of those wells made high water oil ratios, and yeah, generally you're going to complete wells in the oil leg. So that's the way I set it up.
Yeah, but if you look at the high, contentious case like this, I mean, well completion is all that we have to prove your case that there was no completion in the water zone. So if they are producing water, then where is that water coming from? Now you do have that assumption made in such a way that it is making it difficult, for us to know whether even some of these wells were probably completed in the water zone. And I don't have the data. I don't have the simulation data, so I do not have any ways to cross-check that. But thank you for that. Do you know when the encroachment happened in the model?
The encroachment from the St. Andreas?
Yes, into the Greenberg.
It's basically just from day zero almost. Yeah, as we dropped the pressure in the Grayberg, the St. Andreas was just moving up into the Grayberg.
And the previous owner of the site, XTO, did their comprehensive analysis on the site. And, based on the testimony that we've had throughout the whole week, they came up with a problem, that they feel like this is what is happening, where there's a migration into the Greenberg. I want to know, did you incorporate their findings in your history matching effort?
To incorporate what into my history match?
Okay, let me repeat again. So XTO or Chevron did a report, and even it was more or less published by Love et al.
Okay.
So we've seen that we've seen that throughout the testimony this week. They also saw that there is a potential migration of water from the San Andreas into the Greenberg.
Correct.
And they came up, more or less, they established that this could be the problem that is more or less causing this potential migration. So my question to you is that, as you saw the production, or let's say the encroachment right from the onset, did you also incorporate their study as a case study, or more like as one of the scenarios that you run to see if you could have probably gotten a history match?
Well, what I did do is I actually looked at initially shutting off the St. Andreas and trying to build an aquifer into the Grayberg that would start to fit the historical field production. I just never could get it. There's not enough water underneath the Grayberg. I can actually, that was one of my match models that I did in my rebuttal to kind of look at that, but I just couldn't get the physics to work, because basically at the end of the day, you still need a big aquifer, 33 plus billion barrels, as I recall. And you just don't have that much water underneath the Grayberg. And so essentially the water's coming out from this area to the west, and it's just going to hit those edge wells on the west side of the reservoir. So
based on your testimony, I heard that you did not include Empire's SWDs in your earlier history match. Is that correct?
Well, I included all the data I was given. I don't think there was a whole. Actually, I think I did. Yeah, I included all the data I was given. At least Empire's, I think SWDs are included in this model, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. I'll continue from there. So based on what we were discussing earlier, do you believe that the model that you've more or less worked on and presented to the commission comparable to any reports that probably XTO or Chevron put together ever, is there any comparison, clear, let's say apple to apple comparison with regards to the analysis that you can more or less share with the commission?
Yeah, I mean, there was a report, I think in 1990, that said this was primarily a solution drive reservoir and that the water was probably coming from the San Andreas. So obviously that wasn't a simulation study, but it's pretty much what I've seen. That's what I've seen in my model as well. I mean,
are you referring to Laugh's paper?
no, I've got it in my, you can go to my original testimony, and I think even some of the slides I have in my rebuttal, they kind of show some of that early data. It's actually in my rebuttal. I can point to it. Let me see. So yeah, I try to be consistent with figure it's at. One is E8 and E9. Oh, it's like slide M2, for example.
M2?
Yeah. This is Chevron report 1989 that the Grayburg is primarily depletion drive reservoir. And the report also confirmed production bubble plot, confirmed San Andreas water was support in communication through a limited fracture network. So, I mean, that's exactly what the model showed. Do you find it yet? It's M2.
But I thought during the cross, this one was in the AGU field.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the AGU. Right, that is correct. That was just referred to the AGU, but I found that basically that was present. Essentially, it was present across all three leases.
Well, if you look at the, and we'll get to that, if you look at the map that you showed, and we're going back and forth with Mr. Rankin, that shows the location of the wells that do have higher production of water. You see that definitely the AGU is everywhere is more or less flooded, right? But not so much with the EMSU.
Well,
So
it's not everywhere flooded, but it is a little bit more than the other two leases.
well, so I want you to help the commission to understand if there is any prior establishment, or let's say if there is a reference that shows that there is a migration of water into the from the San Andreas to, let's say, the Greenberg, aside what was described by Chevron.
Well, I mean, the other thing I did, we just plot the historical water ratio history at cumulative water ratio in 1987 before the water flood. And that gives you a big picture. As you said, it shows a little bit of water moving down in the AGU. There's that figure. Thought I had that.
Dr. Buckwalter, can you just be sure to speak into your microphone when you're
Oh, I'm
speaking?
sorry.
Thank you.
Apologies. Let me find the figure. There's somewhere. Oh, I know why. It's not in the I have the original. I have the original figures. Can you bring that up? The one that had the it's got the two maps, the depth map or the gross thickness. Could you go forward a little bit? It's one of the ones that's not labeled, so I can't find it.
Is it in your slideshow or your testimony?
Yeah, it's in the slideshow. It's one of the ones that we added. It's probably higher, I guess. Just start in the beginning and just go down. We'll find it real quick.
Right.
Oh, there it was. I'm sorry. Go down. Next one. I think that's it. Okay.
Right here.
So this is just kind of a big picture from 20,000 feet, showing that the down dip wells, for example, EMSU, really don't show much water production. Okay. You see that?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that if you look at is the AGU the one at the bottom?
The AGU is the one at the bottom. And as you said, it looks like it's got a little bit of water, some water moving in there.
Yeah, and if you look at even within the region of the EMSU, I mean, these are more, if you would have checked the completion data, that would have ruled out the fact that these were all in the oil zone, and for some reason, some way, somehow, water from somewhere more or less moved out. But without establishing the fact that because you open everywhere, you open all the perforations, you open throughout the entire Greenberg, and we've seen that there is water right at the bottom of the Greenberg from your team's testimony.
Right.
Right. So if you were able to confirm more on the completion data, that would have really helped us a lot to really, delineate.
Right. And the only thing I would say is if you look at the thinner areas where you're, 60 to 100 feet, where you're relatively thin and not very far above the oil water contact, a lot of those wells universally make almost no water. So even the completions are that wrong. There's not that much area to complete. And I think eventually water should have moved into those wells. But I agree, that would be would be a better model if we constructed that. I don't think it would change the results appreciably, but.
Oh, I mean, in terms of, let's say, the results that you are presenting to the commission, I mean, based on a lot of assumptions that you made, I can also say that it would have used the actual field data, let's say porosity, permeability, AV, from the field data that has been shown to the commission, then I don't have any question. But you didn't do that. And with this high porosity permeability, even I'm surprised that with even 1 millidarcy, I think I read somewhere that even in one of the testimonies that even 0.5 millidarcy, there could be a communication between the San Andres and then the Greenberg.
No, it would never work. It's just too much water moving up. It's a very limited fracture network that fits this production. And that much I can say for sure.
Okay.
So, I mean, let's think of this big picture, okay? The water's got to be coming from somewhere. You can't put it coming in from west to east because you'll never, no matter what you do with the completions, you're still going to lose the match on the west side of the wells, of the reservoir. And big picture, if you just take the limited aquifer that's in the Grayburg and you don't have that San Andreas communication, you just can't get everything to fit. And, we've seen the pressure drop in the San Andreas before the water flood. So that in itself shows that there was communication between the reservoirs, right?
No, but there are water wells in there too.
Oh,
There are water production wells in the San Andreas.
well, the production I have for the injection and water supply wells start later than 1987. So how did the pressure drop in the San Andreas? Something's happened. And
You're saying is your testimony that the pressure in the San Andreas dropped prior to any water that has been taken out.
correct.
But I thought in your direct, you talked about the fact that you couldn't match your historical data and you consulted Empire's engineers and they brought to your attention that there are water producing wells. And once you put them in, bingo, you got a match. I remember that correctly.
Let me think about that. Well, I'm referring, let me look at when the water injection started.
Water
and
production.
Prior to 1987, basically what we did is Okay, there's two different things, the primary history match and then what happened from 87 forward, okay? Prior to 87, I didn't have any saltwater disposals. I didn't have any water supply wells. And the only way that I could fit that production was to put the communication that you see here, okay? And then after that, basically the model, if I just run the model forward, I had for those if I put all the saltwater disposal wells in, I was missing some of the water supply well. But that happened after 1987, okay? So I couldn't get a match on the current pressure. So what I had to do is I had to put in some additional water supply volumes to get things to match currently, if that makes sense.
Well, then it sounds like I listened to something different because I remember what I said earlier on, that you said you have to put in that water wells before. Once you did that, it just did the magic for you.
Yeah, it did, but it was after 1987. Does that make sense?
Well,
My saltwater
clear to me.
disposal, I think you can look, we can actually look at that on a field plot.
Okay. Yeah, I can check into that record. So
We can look
I
at
can
that. We've
check
got
into
that
that.
on a plot, I think somewhere. Let me
probably
see.
there might be direct or something like that, but let's probably proceed.
Okay. So it's like
Um,
two different things there.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. Okay, definitely we might want to revisit that. If there's something that can be shown to establish that, that will clear my mind on that one.
I think I can clear your mind on that. If you wait a minute, I can find the plot. Yeah, I know you can't see it, but Exhibit M10 shows when the water supply well volume started and when the saltwater disposal injection records as well.
What is that, Dr.
It's
Buckwalter?
Exhibit M10. I know it's really hard to see though, but you okay. Is it M10? Oh, I've got it mislabeled here. Is it M9? Yeah, it's this plot here. So that, I could blow that up and see. I thought it was 1994, but not 100% sure. But it was, I guess you can't blow that up, huh? Anyhow, you can look at this and you'll see.
Yeah, I just. Before the injection. Yeah. So, doctor, when I look at the map that you showed, just checking, I saw that you said the pressure was recorded at 1986 prior to the prior to the water flat.
Correct.
So definitely, if I look at even the map that you're showing, I saw that the water wells came on stream before you had the measurement.
I have to look at that. Hey, can you blow that figure up to where I can see it? I'm just trying to see the scale on it. I mean, I know everything fits. I just can't, can't remember what the timing looks like. Can you just blow that up and see when that is? Oh, that's that exhibit I5. Let's see what that looks like. I think it's 1994. Oh, that's okay. No problem. So that plot on the left.
Right there.
It's the other one actually. Side 5, it's higher than that. 19. It's right around that time, isn't it?
Exactly. It's right around that time,
It's
but
right around that time that we got the pressure. So,
so if you go to the bottom one, if you go to the bottom,
okay, the injection started in 19. The injection started in 1994, but 1986 is where the saltwater disposal started.
yeah, so if you look at the bottom one, you know, you have the bracket where you have 84 or so to, let's say, 88 or 98. So definitely there was that pressure measurement prior to the, you have the water wells before you got the measurement.
That may
I mean,
be
that is what
true.
I've been listening to throughout the testimony. So it's a little bit different from what you are saying, and even the chart shows that.
Well, I know I fit the pressure at that point. Maybe I did have the water supply wells at that point. It is what it is, but it did match. We did match the pressure at that time. It was measured. It was somewhere 300 to 500 pounds in there, and I matched that. So
Yeah, for sure. But once you are withdrawing from it, we all know that there has to be a pressure reduction in there. So, I'm just trying to see, aside your model, is there any documentation, any reservoir engineering data that confirms the fact that there is some kind of communication? Did you do material balance analysis on all the, is it the number of wells?
So if you think about it, the model is a big material balance, isn't it? Where we try to get everything to fit. That's what it is.
I mean, with this model, I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure if this model more or less meets material balance.
Well, we fit the historical pressures that we have. Wouldn't you concede that? We fit the production history. And with that leak was part of fitting that production history up to date. And, it's really quite simple. If you concede that the Grayburg does not have a strong edge water drive aquifer, which it can. If you think about it, think of it this way, okay? Big picture. If the Grayburg just has an edge water drive aquifer, it's a small aquifer, small amount of water underneath the Grayburg. How did we get all that water in those up-dip wells? You won't, even with the purse not exactly in there correctly. So the water's got to be coming from the bottom somewhere else. And we're fitting the historical production and pressures. Is this a perfect model? It's not a perfect model, but it's a very good model for understanding, at least on a material balance perspective, what goes on in this reservoir.
It's definitely Chevron would have documented that, because if you're having this problem, I mean, how do you have a successful water flood after they have been able to flood that reservoir all the way to like 25% residual oil?
It's a good question. Why did they start this water flood? But they did.
And it was successful. I mean,
it wasn't that successful. If you look at the primary recovery factor versus water flood, it's not a big difference.
I'm just looking at your relative PEM and even the report. Prior to water flood, it was 50% average oil saturation. And at the end of the water injection, it was 25. I mean, 25 right there is where we start our CO2 flood. So it's a successful flood. So that means if there was a communication, they might have solved it. Other than that, I don't know if they were going to get a successful water flood. And you are the reservoir engineer, tell me.
Well, think of it this way. That water moving up in this 5% of the wells, that supplemented the water flood a little bit, didn't it? But unfortunately, because it's not moving up uniformly where those injectors are, those areas are producing excessive water. So it's not a very efficient addition to the water flood itself.
Then the question becomes, what is the volume of the water that was injected during the water flood, and then what is the volume of the water that was produced. That is material balance, and that should tell us straight away.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's what we do in the simulator, isn't it? We put in the production, we basically try to get all these curves that fit, and it becomes a material balance. You're exactly right. It's a complicated material balance because it's two reservoirs that interact with one another, but it is a material balance. And if you think about it, what this is a sophisticated material balance. I mean, you can say, could have put in more geology, could have increased the put a permeability field. I can see there's a lot of things that we could add to this model. But if you think in terms of just simple analysis of what's gone on here, it's clear that the water is coming up from the bottom, and just think of it as material balanced. And as a material balance, it holds together extremely well.
So, you are saying that is a simple problem, but it's not a simple problem. I mean, the commission has to look at, let's say, the science behind it, the data behind it, at least to help us to make a good decision. Because, let's say you've given us the model, everything is great. But if someone comes in and gives actual production history data, just using the data to tell us whether there is a communication or not a communication, I mean, that is a material balance.
Yeah,
So
essentially that's what I've done, but with 638 wells, you have to put in everything to really see what's going on. This is not a simple problem. It's not simple as looking at this with a microscope and say, oh, this well's doing this and that well's doing that. This model was designed to answer a question. It wasn't designed to create a perfect history match. I mean, at least a well-by-well history match. It was designed to create a field-wide match and a good match of the water moving up from the San Andreas in about 100 wells. And if you shut that off, you can see on a well-by-well basis where you can no longer see that water coming up into the San Andreas.
if we can go to Exhibit M1 in the document, I don't know, it's still on the slide. So if we can go to M1, where you are showing the grid.
M1.
Yeah, so probably might be, yeah, right.
You
there,
just want the
M1.
picture there?
Yeah, M1.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So on the left, this is more, the left is the boundary of the model. Is that correct?
That's only the boundary of it's a boundary of the Grayburg, and in addition, it includes the additional saltwater disposal wells in this area. And on the bottom there, what you're seeing is just a part of the aquifer that is underneath this grid. The grid was actually eventually extended like 33 miles to the west to match the St. Andreas pressures that we've seen in production and leak.
So on this one, I know there was a back and forth. I mean, for the commission, we are just focusing on the EMSU. I think I heard you saying that there's no way you can get a match for the EMSU without adding all the other units. Is that correct?
And that surprised me, to be honest. I thought I could build a simple model here, just the EMSU. It just didn't fit. And I realized that historically fluids have moved back and forth between these leases. Hard to believe. You wouldn't think so, but once you run the model, you see that is actually the fact. In fact, true.
I thought that we can put the boundary condition in such a way that we have a higher pore volume right at the boundary to be able to match, let's say, only the EMSU.
I thought so too, and I tried it. What you think and what happens aren't always the same thing in life. So I thought so too. It really surprised me because honestly, I didn't want to build a 638 well model, to be honest. This is the last thing that I wanted to tackle. I mean, if I just had the EMSU, I would have had a model that was a third the size of this. It would run, 5 times faster, and I could have done this far quicker.
Sir, so you do have 3 layers within the San Andreas. And it makes me wonder, and based on the cross-examination, I got to know that you did not delineate between the upper and then the lower San Andreas. Is that still your testimony?
Yeah, I mean, this was as I was given. This is geology I was given, doctor, and I just put this in. If it turns out there is a boundary somewhere in the San Andreas, then you know, you can always modify the model. I could increase the porosity a little bit, or the net to gross, or whatever, and end up with an equivalent model. Because at the end of the day, we want that aquifer behavior to match what we've seen historically. And that would take some adjustments in the model, but it could be accomplished. And once again, if you think of this in terms of big material balance, that aquifer has to behave the same way, whether I use this 1,100 feet or if I make it thinner, it's just going to have different properties so that from a fluid flow perspective, it would essentially do what we're seeing here.
So, sir, is it your testimony that numerical dispersion and probably Peclet number or whatever is not relevant in this case?
I mean, for a model of this size, I wasn't thinking that deep. I was just basically using Darcy's law. And for fluid flow, and just let things flow and see what happens until I got things that fit.
Is it black oil or compositional?
Just a black oil model here.
It's black oil.
So it's, you know, 3-phase black oil model. We can add condensate as well.
So is it your testimony that the 3 layers within the San Andreas fully described the geology within the San Andreas?
Well, describe the geology I was given. I mean, we can fight about what the geology in San Andreas looks like, but what I can tell you is we have a very large, probably 150 plus billion barrel aquifer down there to get things to fit.
And you said that you extended the aquifer for the San Andreas. Did you also extend the model domain for the Greenberg and then the top layer?
I actually could not do that. If I go outside of that and I try to extend that, if you look at with that oil water contact, I'd have too much oil.
Exactly. I mean, that is also a problem for me to understand. Why are we extending the bottom of our model, but not extending the other top layers? So is it more like a null cell for the?
Yeah, it's null cells that we have out there essentially in the match model. I mean, the model I created later is I tried to extend the aquifer in the Grayberg, but I did in such a fashion that I didn't increase the oil in place.
If you increase the oil in place, then it is telling you that there is a boundary. There is some kind of a boundary where your reservoir is actually drawing from, but you decided to extend that. You extended the bottom to suit your situation, right? But what about the top?
Well, if you extend the top, you have too much oil.
But that is a reservoir. I mean,
yeah. Well, I'm not saying you can extend the top, but if I extended the oil, the Grayberg laterally any more than I have, I've got too much oil in the model and I can't fit the pressures.
You see, based on all the testimony that we've listened to, there is an aquifer right at the bottom of the Greenberg.
Yes, there is. It's a small aquifer.
So what about if you extended that?
That's essentially what I did in one of my models. And I couldn't get it. I got it to fit on a field-wide basis, but I could not get it to fit the historical water oil ratios we were seeing in the wells.
I thought your objective was to do field match and not necessarily well by well basis. You know, so is it not like, this is what I'm looking for? So I'm just building my model to look for that.
Well, what I tried to do, before you go well by well, when you have 638 wells, you want to look at what's going on in terms of physics, groups of wells in different areas, and when you do that, you can see that this Grayberg aquifer has to basically not be big enough to get this all to fit. I mean, we've got a match in the rebuttal that fits the production, but it doesn't fit the fluid behavior that we've seen here.
But sir, in your so many years of experience, have you seen a model where we kind of have a top layer, but we struck the bottom layer. Have you seen such a model before?
I've built models like this. I mean, let's just pretend the Grayberg is larger. Why aren't there any more wells outside this area? If you extend if you extend extend the oil, let's say to the west, you end up with too much oil in the model, and you can't history match it.
Yeah, so then I thought that your model has to mimic that boundary. And then even within your bottom, you have that pore volume to take care of. I mean, I don't know why we should extend the bottom without extending the top, and then you just mute all the top. Yeah, that's
Well, there's just, there's not enough water on the bottom of the Grayberg. So you have to extend it to the west. And that's essentially what I did, extend it to the west without adding additional oil volume so I could get a history match. And keep in mind, we're talking details, think big picture, think in terms of sophisticated material balance, if you will. And in terms of sophisticated material balance, this fits, on a field-wide basis, it fits well and fits all the data. And I also say that Goodnight hasn't constructed their model. If they've got a different interpretation, I'd like to see it. At least I'm fitting things.
Yeah, but this is what is in front of the commission, and I'm just trying to understand how you set the model in such a way to satisfy, let's say, what you're looking for. What about like the Greenberg? Do you have a direct evidence to prove the size of the aquifer within the Greenberg?
The only evidence I have is if I make the aquifer, if I just say the aquifer is attached to the Grayberg, I can fit the production of oil, water, gas. I can't fit, if we look from currently, there's been more water injected in the San Andreas than been withdrawal, so that pressure should be higher. We have the fact that in 1986, the pressure dropped in the San Andreas from original pressure. So I assume that's, that is from the communication with the Grayberg. So, you can look at a lot of different pieces, but maybe one piece in and of itself doesn't tell the complete story. So,
yeah. So, doctor, did you have, let's say, pressure data for all the wells, or is just these 1 or 2 points that you use in your model?
In the San Andreas, I didn't have a lot of pressures. In the Grayberg, I basically had a pressure that in 1986, prior to water flooding, I had like 7 or 8 wells I looked at and kind of tuned the model to the current pressures. And there's several hundred pounds of pressure difference currently in the model as well.
Yeah,
And
so
where
as
you
you
from
know,
one point to another.
sorry. So as you know, in our reservoir engineering, if you have pressure data for all the production and then let's say the injection wells in that area,
Right.
those are actual data.
Exactly. And that's what I'm matching as well. I kind of did 2 things. I look at the well matches and the overall volumetric hydrocarbon weighted pressures as well, and just tried to get that to fit. So kind of get the big picture to fit, and then also look at the individual wells as well. But I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of pressure data here, but certainly enough from a material balance perspective, I think, to create an accurate model.
Can we go to the Goodnight Cross Exhibit 6, where they show the table of the porosity and permeability data? And I promise I will end soon.
No rush.
Okay. So the first question I have for you is, in terms of permeability, is this a homogeneous model or heterogeneous model?
It's essentially a homogeneous model.
And from all the testimony that we've heard throughout the whole week, do you believe that the Greenback Formation and also the San Andres is a homogeneous reservoir?
No, obviously it's not a homogeneous reservoir. This permeability was a permeability required to match the production and the injection on a field-wide basis. So if anything, it's a little high, right? There's going to be tight areas and probably better, well, not better areas, because these perms will fit the production and injection on all the wells.
So, sir, why did you not vary the permeabilities, the KZ, for, let's say, zone 5, 6, 7, where we do know that there is some kind of an aquifer in the Greenback, to see if you could get a match?
Well, there's not enough water down there no matter what you do. This fit there's just not enough water anyhow. There's just a small amount of water underneath in the bottom of the Grayberg. So that's not enough to ever give you a fit. These vertical permeabilities allow me to match the gas. And then I guess the water moving up as well, and the fluid movement between the different.
So when you say there's not enough water there, you and I know that this is a water drive, because once you start producing, water is coming, right? So if it is only connate water, then we have a strong justification that it is small amount of water, and that water is not going to move.
Correct.
But from what we've seen, the water is just moving right from the onset. So why did you not also adjust the permeabilities within the bottom of the Greenback to see if you can match those wells that had a problem?
Well, think about this. I'm completed in the whole sand, so I'm as close to the water as I can get, right? And I put an aquifer. I can build an aquifer out to the west. I can match the production and the pressures. No, I can't match the pressures, but I match the production. But I still have that problem that all the deeper wells in the Grayberg will never match. So, and a lot of those wells are very thin on the western side. And if you put a large aquifer out there, those wells water out no matter what you do, because honestly, the water underneath the Grayberg is almost minuscule in compared to this 33 billion barrels that you have to put west. You can't put enough water under the Grayberg to get things to match. You have to put essentially an edge water drive moving in from west to east, or you have to accept the fact that there's a 1,000-foot sand, not sand, but 1,000-foot reservoir underneath there somewhere that's in communication through this limited fracture network. I'm just saying you can't get all the pieces to fit. You get some of the pieces to fit, but not all the pieces. So, I mean, you can look at this thing with a microscope and say, well, what if you did this and what if you did that? And I've run all kinds of iterations, but ultimately, this is the only model that actually fit all the data.
Yeah, so based on the geology, Doctor, we do have the core data for, let's say, 649 well or something like that. We do know the number of the well. At the end of your history matching, did you look at the permeability right at that grid block to see how close are you even to the geology of the formation?
Well, so when you look at that permeability, that's the permeability of the rock, correct? It does not necessarily include the fractures. So if I look at that, and I did not have that data, but I would assume if I look at that, I would end up with something much slower in the core data than what we actually have to have, due to the fact that we need fractures to enhance the permeability in this reservoir. Big picture, the permeability must be higher than what you're seeing in all these cores. I mean, think of this as just a big material balance, okay? A sophisticated material balance. It's not a model that was designed to basically put in 100 layers and, history match 600 wells. I mean, literally that would take years. The purpose of this model was to create, in your terms, you could think of a sophisticated material balance and see how we can get everything to fit. Big picture, okay? Where can the water come from? Can it come from the Grayburg? No, it can't. It's got to be coming from the bottom. Can we have a continuous leak between the Grayburg and St. Andrews? No, you'll never fit the data. You're going to have tons of water coming up. It would water everything out, right? So.
Yeah, so that is what you might expect. Like, let's say, if there is a clear communication, that is why I was saying that if there is a clear communication, then even water flood, there's no way water flood was going to work here. So help the commission to understand.
The water flood hasn't been very successful. Look at the primary recovery factor and then the water flood recovery factor. It's not that different.
How do you assess the effectiveness?
Can I interrupt just
Sure,
1
sure.
second? It's 3:45. What time did we need to make sure the doctor's on the road?
I don't know how much
I mean, everybody's going like this, but we need a time.
I would rather answer your questions. If I have to fly out tomorrow, it's okay. Don't worry. Let's get through this because I want to make sure that, we finish our battle back and forth here. It's, we're like reservoir. I wish you had built this model. We could do comparison results. So.
That is why I was asking, I was talking to our counsel that, for us, we don't have the input data.
Correct.
So I just have to look at what I'm being presented to be able to fully understand what is going on there.
And I appreciate your problem. The most important thing you could do, and I can't let you understand this, but the most important thing that I did when I built this model in History Match is not the fact that I fit the data. It's the fact all the things that didn't work. I mean, all these issues that you bring up, I've actually looked at all these different things. And, when one thing doesn't work, you have to, it points you to what the right solution is. So just looking at it from 20,000 feet, and you're just looking at all the data, there's all kinds of possibilities for what can happen in this reservoir. And really what brought me finally to the solution was not so much what worked oftentimes as what didn't work to point me in the right direction. So, I mean, I know I'm just talking here, but a lot of times that's how you get the History Match. As you look at what doesn't work and it points in the other direction. So that's just a workflow.
So you talked about the scenarios that you utilized where you saw that the wells that were at the flanks were more or less producing a lot of water.
Right.
So if you use let's say you use oil, so definitely the water was not under control, right?
Yeah, it was controlled with oil, so the water and the gas were predicted. And actually, for those 100 wells, I think in our original affidavit, David, we showed some history matches of oil and water, and they were pretty good. They were actually quite good. And when you put that seal in there, you can see how the water drops in all those wells. So, at least in terms, yes, maybe the completions weren't right, but at least they were fitting the history pretty well with and without the leak, and then seeing how much the water dropped without the leak. So now those are some figures in the original affidavit, and you might want to look at those too, because that was the real focus was trying to get the big picture and then try to model the leak, and that was really where the emphasis was. It wasn't trying to put detailed geology in this model. And, the model's so big that you have to make some assumptions or you're never going to get the answer. So, for example, we put a permeability field in here that allowed us to get the production injection out. So, and if I was doing this for a client, the next step is I would look at where the model is today, and I'd look at a map of oil per acre. I'd identify an area where they looked like there was potential. I'd refine the grid in that area. I'd put detailed geology in that area. I'd history match all the wells in that area. Then I'd put the infill well and see what it would do. Because here's the reality. When I do a consulting study and you give me 20 wells, I figure probably a week and a half to build the model, review the data. And I figure at least a day per well to do a history match. So if I have 20 wells, it's probably, for me, a relatively big project normally. and that might take me four or 5 weeks. If I've got 638 wells, I mean, I can history match those wells, but it's going to take me 638 man days. And so, you know, you can't, this thing is so big that you can't get every little detail in there and hope and ever get an answer. Because if you try to put every little detail in there, you're never even going to get a history match. So you have to start big, as I did here, essentially. And keep in mind, the goal of this model was not to come up with a perfect history match of every individual well. It was, I mean, as you described, you know, you've talked about material balance. That's essentially more or less what we've done here, a very sophisticated material balance. We've integrated the geology and everything, but that's really what it is. Because that's the first step. It's a field-wide match, which would be a very sophisticated material balance. So.
Doctor, so with regards to, let's say, the water coming from the San Andreas to the Greenberg, is it your testimony that it has any impact on oil production?
That's an interesting question. That's a very good question. Okay, well, technically, you would think when that water comes up, it's going to enhance your water flood, right? Common sense, right? The downside of it, the water is not coming up, you know, at these 300 water injectors. It's coming up preferentially in maybe 5% of the reservoir. So it's enhancing the production in 5% of the reservoir, perhaps, but also it's not efficient because it's not basically benefiting the water flood and the other 95% of the reservoir. So what happens eventually is you water out that area and just keep making lots and lots of water. So that's the downside of. But I've thought about that, you know, wouldn't this enhance the water flood, right? It would if it was coming up everywhere potentially, but it's only coming up in these select areas. So initially it probably enhances the water flood a little bit in those areas, but eventually you end up with a situation where you're just blowing a bunch of water through there. And if you're limited to how much total water you can produce in the reservoir, liquid, then eventually what's going to happen is you won't be able to make the same oil rate, will you? So the oil rate will drop off because you'll hit the maximum liquid that you can produce. And so it will it does have some detriment to the production you would have in this reservoir unless you can just lift unlimited water.
On the pressure side, if let's say the bottom layer right here, we do have, let's say, layer 7 and layer 8. I'm curious to see how the pressure distribution looks like for these two layers.
Well, it's really not that different. At least it's not that different under the reservoir itself. I mean, because I'm injecting all 3 layers, right? So it's not going to be that much different. Now, if I just injected in the top layer, it would require some adjustments in the model, wouldn't it? So I'd maybe have to increase the porosity or something, and maybe extend the aquifer out a little more or something. But, you know, eventually you want it to fit. I mean, here's the thing that really fascinated me. You know, the most interesting thing is today I never would have guessed. When you crank up that water injection rate in these saltwater disposal wells, you would think this is a huge aquifer, isn't it? And so you should be able to put as much water as you want in this thing for as long as you want. It shouldn't hurt anything. The problem is you're injecting it at these high rates, and all these wells are relatively close together. So literally within the next 3 years, what the model shows is you build up this, as I said earlier in my testimony, you build up the pressure in St. Andrews under the Grayberg to about 2,700 pounds. At that point, you can't inject any more water. You're essentially injecting about the same amount of water. And essentially, if you think about it, we've got bottom hole pressure controlled wells in the Grayberg, right? So the pressure is staying relatively constant. We're just lifting more water, but the pressure is staying about constant there. Does that make sense? And so the amount of water moving up stays the same. The pressure doesn't increase. And what happens is from that point on, you can see that pressure wave moving out for the next 30, 40 years. And the pressure under the Grayberg remains almost constant, which is really cool. It's literally, you know, when you start this thing, there's a, I forgot what the pressure difference was. I think the pressure dropped 200 pounds at the edge of the aquifer on the far west side. And by the end of it, you can see how this pressure wave just smooths out every 5 or 10 years. And that's something I never would imagine, because I thought when you crank that rate up, that it wouldn't be so detrimental. I thought it would be a lot more detrimental. It is detrimental in the fact that it increases about 50,000 barrels a day. But once it hits that, it's essentially like a pseudo steady state. So that kind of describes the physics a little bit conceptually.
How would you quantify the uncertainty associated with this model?
I mean, I think that from a volume perspective, I think it's very good. I mean, from an individual well perspective, I mean, obviously it needs lots of work. And as I said, from individual well, the next step would be identifying high areas of potential, refine the grid around there for a client, and trying to see what the value is. So, I mean, I think the fact we're matching, we've got almost 90 years of data here. And as you know, if you have 90 years of data, that's pretty hard to match. And the fact that even though we don't have a lot of pressures, we're matching the pressures at some key points. I think our volumes are right. I think our aquifer is about right. And I think this leak is about right as well. You know, obviously the one thing we probably could improve in the model is the PERS. I would concede that. But I don't think that invalidates the model in any way. I think it would improve it a little bit potentially, but it's still going to show the same result.
I heard you said that you adjusted PVT properties.
A little bit. I tweaked it a little bit. But keep in mind, this is 1938. It's not like if I had a PVT lab report, slap me for adjusting the PVT, because that's something you never adjust, okay? But they didn't have this in 1938. They had some estimates, I think, of a original gas oil ratio of 435, and I'm using 375. They had original B sub O of 1.2. I'm using 1.14, just using Vasquez and Bedge. We're just a little, because I've got less gas in solution, it comes down a little bit. So you have to realize for a number of years here, there wasn't a whole lot of data. But I also realized that if I started this model where we had good data, I have the wrong description of the reservoir, right? So you really, I insist you always go back to time zero, okay? Because unless you're God, you don't know what that reservoir looks like after a few years. You just can't initialize the reservoir properly after that time. So.
Okay. I'll probably end here.
You sure?
Yeah, I did have some, but
you know what
I don't know how my other commissioners feel.
I wish we could just sit down and look at the model together and run some what ifs. Because that's really the way to resolve, many of your questions. I've tried to run all those different scenarios, a lot of different scenarios. I've run almost 500 models now, and this is the one that best fit all the data. So I just leave with you that I think it's a good model. It fits the data. I think the volumes are about right. It's a big material balance, essentially. It's a very sophisticated material balance. It's something between a material balance and a finite, a very detailed model. So.
Okay, I'm going to end here. Thank you.
All right. We skipped our afternoon break in the interest of getting Dr. Bookwalter out of here, but I'm thinking, so technically this is a time for redirect of Dr. Bookwalter. What's the commission's preference? It's what, 4 o'clock? Yeah, 4 o'clock. You want to take a break, or shall we push through the last hour?
Oh, God.
Yeah, I can push through. It's up to you. I've been through a marathon already with the professor.
So
They call it a gauntlet, I think.
it is a gauntlet.
Well, I run marathons, so I like the marathon analogy.
Miss Hardy, how long are your questions, would you say?
I don't have much redirect. I mean, if we might be able to take a very quick break.
Yeah, if we
Yeah,
can get out as
fine.
soon as we possibly can, that would be awesome.
What's the commission's preference, Mr.
Video.
Chairman Rosados?
Let's take a 5-minute break.
5 minutes. All right. All right. Be back at 4:05. Thanks. Madam Court Reporter, let us know when we're back on the record.
We're on the record.
All right. Of course, we need a witness.
I think we also need Adam back.
All right, Dr. Buckwalter, the final stretch. I know you thought it would never come, but here it is. Ms. Hardy.
And you'll be happy to hear that I do not have any redirect for Dr. Buckwalter.
Okay, call your next witness. No, just kidding.
Oh.
So,
Wait, I don't know if you're excused. Maybe he be excused, please.
Mr. Rankin.
Yes.
That was a pregnant pause if I ever heard one. OCD,
Yes, he may, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice.
Right, Rice, he may be excused, yeah.
All right, Pilot, do you have an hour or more of questioning?
No, he may be excused. Thank you.
Dr. Buckwalter, thank you very much for your time here today and yesterday.
Thank you, Doctor.
All right, Mr. Rosatos. I guess at this point, we're going to be done, right? For the, we're not going to call another witness today. I mean, it's the end of the week. It's just been, this has been very interesting, but quite lengthy. So are you in agreement with that, Ms. Hardy, that we just pick back up when we next reconvene where we left off with Mr. Melzer?
Well, I think we were planning to hopefully finish Mr. Melzer, but he's here, but I don't know.
Where were
I don't
we
know if we
with
can-
Mr. Melzer? Was it, where were we with him? Who was?
It was Mr. Rankin.
Yeah, I think we could finish Mr. Melzer with less than half an hour, I think. Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, there's just a few things I wanted to follow up with him on that I think we could get him done in half an hour. And I understand that he's here and probably, although Santa Fe is a wonderful place, I'm not sure he wants to.
Mr. Rosatos?
Yeah.
Was that a yes? You're all mine.
Thank you. Mr. Rankin, you said about a half hour?
I think so. I mean, if I'll just explain what I'm planning to do and propose is.
Your co-counsels are looking at you like, really?
I know. Do you believe that? Mr. Melzer introduced in his direct testimony some production data on the tall cotton. And I think for best evidence, I'd like to have, for the commission, have all the production from the Texas Railroad Commission. I think that would be helpful for them maybe to understand what the full production history has been of the tall cotton. Also, the Texas Railroad Commission does have filings related to the application to create that field and for the downspacing that I would like to introduce into the evidence, because I think it's necessary to understand the context of that development. I think it'd be helpful. It's a governmental record from your sister agency in Texas, and if Empire believes that I've left something out from those files, they can supplement it with the additional records from the Railroad Commission.
Mr. Hearing Officer, Mr. Rankin, I'm not used to having the best evidence rule applied to what an expert may or may not consider. It doesn't seem to be appropriate here.
Well, I guess Mr. Melzer presented data up to I believe it was 2019. I can't remember what year it was. I could show you on the screen. So, but he cut off the data for the last 6 or 7 years, and I think it's important for the commission to understand the full data history of that production.
Oh, sure. No, I understand that. Yeah, if you want to elicit that.
Yeah, that's the intent.
Yeah, That does make sense, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Okay, all right. I mean, I guess it's more convenient for the witness that that be elicited today rather than at some point in the future. So I guess, is Mr. Melzer here? There you go, sir. I'm sorry. If you'll come back up to the witness stand. Not that you've forgotten the oath, but just for the record, if you'll raise your right hand, you swear and affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury. All right, and let me just admonish
Turn your microphone on, please, sir.
Let me just admonish you in the interest of time.
Mr. Hearing Officer, the I do may not have been recorded because his microphone was not on.
I do.
Okay, all right. Thank you, sir. In the interest of time, and we've allowed witnesses to go on because it's in the interest of the commission to hear everything and get the fullest, biggest picture possible. But now that the sand is running out of this week's hourglass, please listen to the question, answer the question, then wait for the next question. All right? Thank you. Mr. Rankin.
Mr. Melzer, when we were discussing tall cotton the other day, it feels like weeks ago. Here it is. Okay, so your exhibit C10, you show some production history from the tall cotton project, correct?
Correct.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm showing here on your screen, let me know when you can see it, your exhibit C10. Is that your exhibit?
That is correct.
And on this exhibit C10, you're showing the production history from commencement of the RZ project at Tall Cotton. Is that right?
That's correct.
But you only show it up through November 2019, correct?
Correct.
But the Texas Railroad Commission has the additional production history of this project to present, correct?
Correct.
But you did not show that on your exhibit. Why not?
The operator was about to sell the property.
Back in 2019?
Yep. Was thinking about it.
Okay, but that production history is still available on the Texas Railroad Commission site, correct?
It is.
I'm going to show you what we pulled this down and just because we wanted to see, and we pulled this from the Texas Railroad Commission, and it's full production history that we pulled down from the Texas Railroad Commission, and we just put it on a graph, just and marking where November 2019 you ended your production history in Exhibit C10. Have you reviewed the Texas Railroad Commission's production history for the Tall Cotton project?
I have.
Does this graph represent to you your understanding of what the production history has been since the last production represented on your Exhibit C10?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Examiner, I would request that we be permitted to move the admission of this as Goodnight Cross Exhibit number 9.
Empire.
Mr. Examiner, we're going to object to this graph. We were never provided a copy of this until now. We have no way of knowing whether it's accurate or not, and so, and it's simply last minute surprise kind of thing. So we object to the admission.
Thank you, Mr. Padilla. OCD?
OCD doesn't have an opinion on this exhibit. I don't think I've looked at it before, but given the volume here, I couldn't tell you that it's with certainty.
Mr. Beck?
Was it offered into evidence? Was it offered as an
It's
exhibit?
being offered into evidence now.
I'm unfamiliar with it, so I don't really have a position on whether it should be admitted into evidence.
No objection from pilot.
Let me ask you, Mr. Rankin, where do the numbers that result in this graph after 2019 come from? Are they from an official government or, you know, are they from a reliable official government record?
They are, Mr. Hearing Officer. These are taken from the Texas Railroad Commission
Are
production.
they taken from the same source of data as produced the graph leading up to 2019?
May I inquire from Mr. Melzer? May I inquire from Mr. Melzer where he got his data?
Please.
Mr. Melzer, when you created your exhibit C10, where did you get the production data for that graph?
From the Texas Railroad Commission, what service company that reports from that?
Same source of data, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Okay.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I do think the completeness rule also may apply here.
I agree. I believe it should be admitted. I mean, if you introduce data up to 2019, if the rest of it is based on the same numbers, then we'll admit this exhibit over objection.
Thank you. Mr. Melzer, yesterday during our course of discussion over the fall cotton, you and I discussed some of the details around how the project was set up, the spacing, you know, other details. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
But we didn't have any materials or exhibits to really reference. And so it was sort of a discussion in vacuum. Is that a fair representation of your recollection of that testimony?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, Mr. Melzer, are you familiar with the Texas Railroad Commission generally?
Yes.
And so it's possible to go online and go to the Texas Railroad Commission and identify case files where different cases have been presented to the commission in Texas.
Yes.
And you can pull down documents that are filings for applications creating field rules such as tall cotton.
Yes.
Have you done that yourself for the tall cotton field?
Not for the tall cotton.
Okay. And generally, in addition to the applications for relief, such as for creation of field rules or down spacing, do applicants also present evidence and testimony through the commission as they do here in New Mexico?
I believe so. Yes.
And that information is retained in case files as they're presented to the commission in Texas. Is that right?
Not as familiar with New Mexico rules, but I would guess they are very similar.
Okay. So I guess what I have here, Mr. Melzer, is I have, we downloaded this file from the Texas Railroad Commission, and it's Kinder Morgan's application for a new field designation to adopt field rules for the proposed tall cotton field. And this particular file is 46 pages. And when you look at what it contains, it's the and this is the order it was presented. Initially, it's a cover letter with the final order approving of the field rule, creation of a field rule for the tall cotton project. And then it has the examiner's report and recommendation outlining what has been requested for relief. And here I've highlighted just to make clear that it's Kinder Morgan is seeking a pilot study for hydrocarbon recovery to inject CO2 into a residual zone in the San Andres Formation. And it gives some details about what's being requested, as well as a discussion of the evidence that was presented, which I've highlighted. And then some more details about the type of ROZ that was type of ROZ field that was described in the application and the evidence.
Mr. Rankin, could you just maybe move your cursor and get rid of that little white box in the bottom left?
Oh. Doesn't, it's, just, I don't know why it's doing that. Maybe I'll try stop sharing and then I'll start.
No. Sheila, can you move your cursor? There you go.
Okay. I can take the blame. Okay. Anyway, I'll just go back up here. You'll see it's the examiner's report, statement of the case, identifying what's being requested, the name of the field, a discussion of the evidence from the examiner's report and recommendation to approve the creation of the field, describing what the request is,
Your microphone, Mr. Padilla.
I'm going to object. It's Mr. Rankin testifying about what's contained in this thing. If he has a witness to tell us what it says, but this is just some kind of testimony by Mr. Rankin that is inappropriate.
Well, I tend to agree. I mean, what's the point? This appears to be some sort of collateral document. I mean, I understand Mr. Melzer referred to the tall cotton, but where are you going with this?
Mr. Hearing Officer, I understand it's a little unconventional. I would like to move the admission. I think it'd be helpful for the commission to understand what was presented to the Texas Railroad Commission, what was being proposed by Kinder Morgan, the nature of the project, the spacing, and then the subsequent hearing and request to downspace that acreage. Mr. Melzer and Mr. Trenton both identified the tall cotton as a very successful project. They represented it as being very successful based on Mr. Melzer's Exhibit C10, showing the very good production, maxing production at 3,000 barrels a day. And I just think it's important and fair for the commission to see at least what's available at its sister agency in terms of what the project was, what the proposal was, and I think it would be useful and important to have it for the commission's consideration.
You know, I think it's over the top. It's way too much collateral information. Why can't you establish this point with your witnesses during your case in chief?
I can try.
All right. Your objection will be upheld, Mr. Padilla. We won't admit this.
Mr. Examiner, Hearing Officer,
I want to make clear, if you want to question the witness more about, the information, you're welcome to do so. We just don't need the exhibit in evidence.
I understand. Mr. Melzer, you recall yesterday that we were discussing, I asked you whether you were familiar with the economics of the project.
Yes, sir.
And you said you weren't very familiar with it because it was hard to identify or confirm. Correct.
Correct. Capital costs.
Yeah. And you yourself haven't done any investigations of what was reported in terms of the proposed costs or actually incurred costs?
No, but I have different, I know I'm violating the spirit here, but there are some auxiliary information here about why they've done what they've done.
Okay. Let me ask you this, when in your testimony, when you presented this exhibit C10, and I think it's exhibit, let me see if I can find it. Exhibit C4 here, you've identified the Kinder Morgan tall cotton phases 1 and 2. You've highlighted them in yellow. Did you do that because you believe that these are analogous projects for purposes of evaluating the EMSU?
In several ways. In several ways, they're not.
Okay. In the way that it's a proposed greenfield ROZ?
That would be one analog, yes.
And that they're both would be targeting the San Andreas?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Hearing Officer, I have no further questions this time of Mr. Melzer. You can be available for cross-examination or redirect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rankin. Redirect for Mr. Melzer.
Mr. Hearing Officer, OCD does not have any cross-examination.
I'm sorry.
That's up. It's 4:30 on Friday. So no, nothing from OCD.
Rice,
No questions. Thank you.
Pilot,
No questions.
Commission.
No questions for me.
All right, Dr. Ampoma.
Probably let me ask Steve about the 2 questions. It would be bad if I don't ask a question. Steve, so if you look at the situation that we have here, the San Andreas in the EMSU, that has undergone significant volume of water injection. can you tell the commission in terms of how, let's say, the wettability and all the processes that enable flow and all of that, how is the successful recovery here going to be? Is it going to be like, is there any issues that could more or less hinder a successful recovery here?
Well, there are. Yes, sir. Good questions. The first thing to know is that this was installed in an area adjacent to a long lateral strike slip fault. And they, on the southwest corner, about half of the area has a whole series of fractures, and they were poorly developing the oil from that area because of the fractures. Then they went in and hydrofracked the injectors, and it made it even worse. And the reason that I terminated this thing is because I went down there to ask them, would you, have you considered the fractures that are in that reservoir in the south part, not knowing that they had 3D seismic? And they said, well, we have, we're going to go ahead with the project as we've designed it. And that was in spite of my objections that, and I was a consultant. They didn't pay me, but I was down there as a consultant. And it turned out that they really did mess up the reservoir, especially in the south part of the reservoir. And it was about this time, and I was really frustrated because it was such an important test of the residual ozone greenfields. But it wasn't my money, so I didn't have any authority clearly. And so, yes, that was a real issue. And I didn't feel like it was fair to evaluate greenfields on the basis of that mistake they made. And so that was one factor. The other factor that came into play was they had considered whether or not they were going to sell the flood. It was not a high performing flood because of the costs involved. I knew that. And so that was another factor that really came in later after the hydrofracks that they did. So I did want to get that on the record because it really does explain the presentation and the exhibit that I put in my testimony.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Lampkin has some questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just have one question. Are you aware of any other fields that are analogous to the MSU where there was conformance issues across the base of the main pay and the top of the RAWs?
Not on the top of the RAWs, but I am familiar with the Maljamar project to, I guess, an anecdotal level. It was done by Conoco really early in the phases of CO2 development, and they did have fracture issues there. And you might remember my exhibit where where I was proposing that we might consider this as a vertical flood. And I really think this is a wonderful opportunity for that. Now, there is no analog for that. There's another project that's being designed currently to drill the horizontals near the base of the RAWs and sweep upwards. And so I'm really excited about that potential. And this would be a wonderful field for it because I do believe the fractures are there. And we've been debating the fractures and the seals, because if you did have a bad seal, the vertical flood wouldn't work. But because of the tension that was created in the dynamics, tectonic dynamics of the field generation, there have to be a very large amount of vertical fractures in this field.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, Steve, I missed one. So you talked about in one of the fields that you presented, they did whack in the ROZ. They did whack.
Oh, yes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So did they produce any oil during the water injection phase?
Very little, except you could argue in the top of the RAWs, there's always some mobile oil. When you hit it with expansion gas, or like CO2 does, it does mobilize. And it's a good light oil. It comes out just beautifully. And that's why those wells were extended in those brownfields, because of that fact too. So once you get deeper in the raws, there's more. I don't like to call it dead oil, but it really does need gas.
Okay.
And that's why CO2 works in the raws.
Thank you.
Mr. Padilla, redirect.
Mr. Meltzer, yesterday, Mr. Rankin asked you about two terms. He asked you about technically recoverable
Yes, sir.
and economically recoverable.
Yes, sir.
I believe your testimony indicated that you could not comment on economically recoverable as far as the San Andreas underlying the AMSU, correct?
Correct.
Now, how about the term technically recoverable? What does that mean?
Okay, it's a great point to make. The resources that are present, like in the residual oil zone, we know how to estimate those. We oftentimes have reservoir factors that play into the economics of the project because, for instance, the fractures. And so every field has got a different characteristics. We've got great analogs, but always those analogs have some difference in characteristics of the reservoir that we have to consider. And this one being a great example where it's got the vertical fractures that could allow vertical movement of the CO2 from bottom to top and create a lot of contact of oil that wouldn't be created if you just drilled vertical wells. So it's still in the research phase, I got to admit. But on the other hand, this would be the field I would pick to go after that as a concept for a redesign. And so I'm kind of dancing around your economics question, but you can't, when it's a resource, you can't say that it's economically recoverable. And really, it's even short of a PUD, proved undeveloped resource, in the reserve world that they talk about. So yeah, it's a difficult question and a more difficult answer.
In the San Andreas underlying the AMSU or the other two units, do you believe there's sufficient oil saturation to explore the possibility of doing the technical recovery?
Yes, sir. I actually feel very strongly about that because what we have done through our research over the years is we've looked at the residual oil saturations from water floods and from CO2 floods and from Mother Nature's water floods. And ironically, maybe coincidentally, they're all about the same. They range generally from 30 to 40%, sometimes as high as 45. And that's from water flood residual, and that's from Mother Nature's residual. And you could argue the pore flushing volumetrics that we talked about, say with Dr. Lindsay's presentations, why in the world, if you had all that pore flushing, would you still have 30 or 35% oil saturations? And the answer is there's a lot of microbial activity associated with wetting the reservoir. Back to the answer I didn't give the doctor. But yeah, 30 to 35% is very likely to be the residual oil saturation all the way down to 100 feet above the bottom of the ROZ.
What do you mean by microbial activity?
Okay, this is opening up a question that I have got it on my website and I have not published on it, but what happens is, by the way, the microbes also create dolomite. And they will do their processes. These are inherent bacteria in the reservoir, even from back in the days of Pennsylvania and Permian. And what they do is they change the surface of the rock by changing it from limestone to dolomite. And then any oil that's present will then affix to the new surface and make it oil wet. And we have seen this time and again. And so the microbes have a big, huge role to play in the wettability concept that's really not in the literature yet. And so I've been reluctant to do it because it's really difficult to document in a way that science would want it documented. but it looks to me like it's inevitable. If it's in a carbonated reservoir and water moves through it, flushes through it, it will create oil wet reservoirs. And it really is the same process when oil gets entrapped. Initially, when you're moving water out and you're moving oil in, you've got a flow field and those microbes act to partially oil wet the reservoir. So it explains mixed wet characteristics of almost every dolomitic reservoir.
Would you term the ROS underlying the MSU as oil wet?
I would, for that reason.
Yesterday, Mr. Rankin asked you about whether you had considered the 6 water supply wells, the Goodnight saltwater disposal wells, and the Empire water supply wells.
Did I examine them?
Yes.
I did not.
Do those wells make a difference as far as your conclusion that there is a ROS underlying the MSU is concerned?
Well, knowing that they didn't produce oil when they removed that water doesn't surprise me at all. Because once you're 50 feet into the ROS, it won't produce oil. That's all residual oil and it's stuck to the rock.
Okay. Now, in terms of going back to economically recoverable term, what effect does water injection in the volumes that Goodnight is injecting into the MSU have?
On the first point, I don't think it'll move any oil because we can't move that oil without some kind of an EOR method. I do think that it will create a problem with water production and hence the economics will be affected. So it's sort of like exchanging the water that they've introduced by water disposal into a problem of water disposal for the CO2 EOR project. So we might be swapping operators of the water. So
would that increase costs of operating ROZ?
No doubt. Yes.
Yes. That's all the questions I have on redirect.
I think he answered my questions on cross about what he reviewed and what he analyzed with respect to the EMSU. So I don't think I have any further questions for Mr. Melzer. He may be excused.
He may be excused.
He may be excused.
No objections from pilot to the excusal.
I'm just kidding.
A long way to Socorro.
Mr. Melzer, thank you for being here yesterday and today.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time and your and your expertise. All righty. Are we done for the day, folks?
May I raise a housekeeping matter just about, I guess we're still waiting for confirmation, I think, on the resumption of the hearing. Is that true? On the dates? Or do we have that?
No, I think we're pretty solid.
I have a question then to raise. I think out of fairness, we have established a basis for submitting our any additional or evidence and testimony 2 weeks in advance of the hearing. And also given our work requirements and obligations for our experts who are going to be providing survey rebuttal, I would ask that instead of March 15th, that we have a deadline 2 weeks in advance of the recommencement of this hearing to submit our any additional survey rebuttal instead of March 15th. 2 weeks prior to our reconvention or.
So that just takes you into just the following week?
I'm sorry, let me just pull up my my calendar. As it was at April 7th. So it'll be 2 weeks prior, March 24th instead of March 15th. So that would be
Mr. Moander.
From OCD's perspective, the hearing's been convened and OCD's not comfortable with yet another round of submittals of rebuttal this and additional evidence that if this were hypothetically a jury trial, this would be out of the question, I would think. Now, granted, we're in front of the commission, which is an administrative agency, but again, the hearing has started and this starts to sound like lots of horse changing midstream. OCD is uncomfortable with that.
Just talking about the Buckwalter.
Oh, just the Buckwalter. Oh,
it's the commission ruled that we were authorized to submit SIR rebuttal in response to Mr. Burkhead and Mr. Bailey. And so rather than submitting it on March 15th, I'm just asking that we do it on March 24th.
So 1 second.
Yeah.
So Mr. Moander, this is for the instead of striking all of the
I
testimony.
misunderstood.
No, it's fine. So are you,
I'll withdraw that objection because that's already been
I
addressed.
just wanted to make sure that you were with,
I'll confess the brain's probably a little foggier than
I
I'd
think
like
for
to
all of
admit at
us.
this point.
no worries. I
So
was going to say, well, a lot of things are just not. kosher
withdraw
right now.
Mr. Chair.
No worries. No worries. Okay. The 24th. Yes, sir.
For the part of Empire, we would object to the move to March 24th. In the first instance, we disagree that any of the testimony was anything but proper rebuttal. If you look at the witness statements, every single statement is couched in a direct rebuttal to the Goodnight case in chief. With respect to the idea of a written SIR rebuttal, I think that the commission has been incredibly kind with Goodnight on allowing that at all. But with respect to the March 15th date, that allows plenty of time for them to pull that together. We require time for our part to run that by our witnesses so that we can get the technical input from those gentlemen so that we can participate in an intelligent manner, especially just given that this truly will turn into an endless round of SIR rebuttals. And I think the commission was incredibly generous with the March 15th. We would ask that that date stick so that we have time to run it by our folks to participate meaningfully in the hearing on April 7th.
Well, I see that March 15th is actually a
Saturday.
What if we split the baby on this and give you till if we were to give Goodnight until March the 20th, a Thursday, would that still give Empire enough time to review the information?
Not trying to be difficult. We don't think written SIR rebuttals at this point is cost effective, is helpful, is in due course. We respect the commission's decision. We think March 15th is incredibly generous and is the correct date.
Okay. Well, let's, I'm gonna compromise and we'll give you until Tuesday, the 18th.
Well, Mr. Rankin, it's going to have to be good.
Okay.
That's what he said.
Well, I understood. I mean, the whole reason that we were granted the right to do this was because they presented New Testament evidence with only 2 weeks before the hearing, but
we agree, and that's why we granted it.
Okay. We'll take the 18th.
Yeah. Okay. That's what we'll do. The 18th it is. Okay, everybody. Happy Friday. We will see you April the 7th, bright and early. Thank you. Drive safely to your destinations. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Madam Court Reporter, for your help throughout the week, and we can be off the record.
We are off the record.